Who was the first king of all England? If you ask a historian, they might squint at you, adjust their glasses, and mutter something about Athelstan in the 10th century. If you ask a legend, they might whisper of Arthur. But if you look at the messy, chaotic, fascinating reality of the dirt and the shield walls, the answer isn't a person. It's a process. It's a slow-motion collision of cultures that took centuries to settle into anything resembling a country. Before there was an England, there was the Heptarchy, 7 rival kingdoms fighting for dominance in the ruins of a fallen empire. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, go ahead and drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world we're all drifting off from tonight. Now, let's rewind the clock back to a time when the lights went out. The year is 410 AD. For nearly 400 years, the island of Great Britain has been a province of Rome. That means heated floors, wine imports, straight roads, and a professional army that handles all the loud, violent noises on the frontier, so you don't have to. But the Roman Empire is having a bit of a midlife crisis. Actually, it's more like a terminal organ failure. Visigoths are sacking the city of Rome itself, and the Emperor Honorius has bigger problems than a misty island at the edge of the known world. So, the British leaders send a letter. They're asking for help. They want the legions back, because the Picts, the painted people from the north, are climbing over Hadrian's wall like it's a garden fence. And Honorius writes back. It's known as the Rescript of Honorius, and it essentially says, look to your own defenses. It's the geopolitical equivalent of your landlord moving out, taking the front door with him, and texting you, good luck, as the wolves start circling the driveway. Imagine the silence that must have fallen over the island. It wasn't a sudden apocalypse with explosions and fireballs. It was quieter, eerier. The garrisons marched away, their hobnailed boots fading into the distance. The tax collectors, usually the last to leave any party, packed up their ledgers. The villas, once vibrant with mosaic floors depicting dolphins and gods, began to go cold. The hypercaust systems, those brilliant underfloor heaters, stopped working because there was no one left with the specialized knowledge or the budget to maintain them. Grass started growing through the cracks in the roads. The great stone cities became ghost towns, haunted by the memory of bureaucracy. In this power vacuum, local warlords started popping up like weeds. They called themselves kings or magistrates or tyrants. They were trying to hold on to the Roman way of life, but without the Roman legions to back it up. They were just men in drafty halls wearing outdated togas. The most famous, or perhaps infamous, of these leaders was a man named Vortigern. We don't know if that was his actual name or just a title. It means something like High King or Overlord in the Brittonic tongue. Vortigern is the kind of historical figure who probably thought he was a brilliant strategist right up until the moment everything caught on fire. He was the CEO of a failing company trying to outsource security to the lowest bidder. The situation was dire. The Picts were raiding from the north, and the Scots, who were actually Irish raiders at this time, were hitting the west coast. Vortigern looked at his depleted forces. He looked at the empty treasury, and then he looked east, across the grey, chopping waves of the North Sea. He knew there were Germanic tribes over there, Saxons, Angles, Jutes, who were excellent at violence. They were essentially professional fighters looking for a paycheck. Vortigern had what he thought was a stroke of genius. He would invite these Germanic warriors to Britain. He would give them land in the east to settle on. In exchange, they would act as a buffer zone, fighting off the Picts and protecting Vortigern's realm. It's a classic fight fire with fire strategy. Except in this case, he was fighting fire with gasoline. According to the Venerable Bede and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the year was 449 AD. Three ships, or keels, glided out of the mist and crunched onto the shingle at Ebbsfleet, on the Isle of Thanet in Kent. Stepping off these boats were two brothers with names that sound like they were pulled straight from a fantasy novel. Hengist and Horsa. Their names translate literally to stallion and horse. You have to respect a family that commits to a theme. These brothers were Jutes, from the darkest, coldest tip of the Danish peninsula. They were big, they were heavily armed, and they didn't care about Roman tax law. They met with Vortigern, and the deal was struck. You can imagine the scene. The desperate British king, trying to maintain an air of imperial dignity, negotiating with these two hulking warriors who were probably eyeing up the curtains and wondering if they were flammable. At first, the plan worked perfectly. This is the tragic irony of the whole invitation. The Jutes marched north and smashed the Pictish raiding parties. Vortigern patted himself on the back. He had solved the security crisis. The British elites relaxed. The wine, what was left of it, flowed again. But Hengist and Horsa weren't tourists. They sent word back home. They told their cousins and kinsmen that the soil in Britain was rich. The weather was, well, tolerable, and the locals were soft. More ships arrived, then more. What started as a security contract turned into a mass migration. We aren't just talk about soldiers anymore. We're talking about families, livestock, pottery, and culture. The Saxon shore forts, originally built by Romans to keep these people out, were now being manned by the very people they were designed to repel. The tension began to rise. It's a tale as old as time. The mercenaries realized they held the sword, and the man paying them only held the purse. They demanded more supplies, more food, more clothing. The provisions are insufficient, they argued. Vortigern, realizing he had lost control of the situation, likely tried to refuse. That refusal was the spark. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle puts it bluntly. The mercenaries stopped fighting the Picts and turned their shields toward the Britons. This is the moment the invitation officially expired. The Jutes, joined now by Angles and Saxons pouring in from across the sea, broke out of their containment zone in Thanet. The legends speak of the Night of the Long Knives, a story where Hengist invited the British nobility to a peace conference and ordered his men to pull concealed knives from their boots and slaughter their hosts. Whether that specific dinner party massacre happened is debated by historians, but the metaphor is perfect. The trust was shattered. The alliance was dead. Fire spread across the island. Bede, writing centuries later, describes it with almost biblical horror. He writes of buildings leveled, priests slain at the altar, and the remnants of Roman civilization crashing down. The groans of the Britons were no longer directed at Rome. They were screams into the void. The British refugees fled west, into the mountains of Wales and the peninsula of Cornwall, taking their language and their Christianity with them. Horsa, the brother named Horse, didn't survive the initial wars. He fell in battle at Aylesford, fighting against Vortigern's son. But Hengist lived. He didn't just live, he conquered. He established himself not as a mercenary captain, but as a king. He carved out the first permanent foothold in the wreckage of Roman Britain. This wasn't just a military invasion. It was a replacement of reality. The stone villas were abandoned for timber halls. The Latin language, with its complex grammar and imperial echoes, was drowned out by the guttural, rhythmic sounds of Old English. The Christian god, who had seemed to abandon the Britons, was replaced by Woden, the one-eyed wanderer, and Tunor of the hammer. By the time the smoke cleared from this first wave of violence, the map had changed forever. The unified province of Britannia was gone. In its place was a fractured mosaic of tribal territories. The chaos of 410 to 450 AD didn't result in a new emperor or a restored republic. It resulted in the seed of something entirely new. The Jutes held the southeast corner, the Garden of England. To the west and north, other warlords were landing their ships, eyeing the river valleys and the old Roman roads. The Heptarchy hadn't fully formed yet. We don't have 7 clear kingdoms just yet. But the players were taking their seats. The board was set. The Roman exit was complete, and the Germanic entrance was thunderous. As night falls over the smouldering ruins of Vortigern's kingdom, we leave the Britons retreating into the mist of the west. The eastern shore now belongs to the men of the North Wind. The first kingdom, the Kingdom of Kent, is about to rise from the ashes of the invitation that went wrong. And in that kingdom, a descendant of Hengist will soon face a different kind of invasion. One armed, not with iron, but with a book. If you stand on the white cliffs of Dover today and squint through the sea mist, you can almost see the coast of France. It's only 20-odd miles away. In the late 6th century, that narrow strip of water was the difference between the known world and the edge of the map. While the rest of Europe was slowly putting itself back together after the fall of Rome, converting to Christianity and writing things down in Latin, England had gone dark. It had become a land of oral histories, blood feuds, and wooden gods. But the first crack in that isolation was about to form, not through war, but through a marriage alliance. We find ourselves now in the Kingdom of Kent. Of all the emerging territories in the Heptarchy, Kent was the most sophisticated. It was the land of the Jutes, those descendants of Hengist we met earlier. Because of its geography, sticking out like a thumb toward the continent, it was the first place to trade, the first to hear news, and the first to get rich. They had access to Frankish wine, glass, and jewelry. The King of Kent wasn't just a muddy warlord. He was a man of international commerce. His name was Ethelbert. It's a name that carries weight. By the year 597, Ethelbert wasn't just the King of Kent. He was the dominant figure in southern England. The Venerable Bede lists him as a Bretwalda, a ruler of Britain, claiming he held sway over all the English peoples south of the River Humber. He was powerful, wealthy, and secure. But Ethelbert had a problem, or perhaps an opportunity, sleeping in the bed next to him. Her name was Bertha. She wasn't English. She was a Frankish princess, the daughter of the King of Paris. This was a prestigious match for Ethelbert. It proved he was a player on the European stage. But the marriage contract came with a very specific, non-negotiable clause. Bertha was a Christian. Ethelbert, a devout pagan who traced his lineage back to Woden, had to agree to let her practice her faith undisturbed. Imagine the dynamic in that royal household in Canterbury. The king is feasting in the great hall, pouring libations to the thunder god, while his wife is in a small, refurbished Roman chapel nearby, chanting psalms. Bertha brought a chaplain with her, a bishop named Leodhard. For years, they were likely the only two Christians in a sea of Germanic paganism. They restored an old Roman church dedicated to Saint Martin, which still stands today, the oldest church in the English-speaking world. You can imagine the king walking past it, hearing the strange, melodic Latin murmurs drifting out, and wondering if he'd made a mistake. But the real change didn't come from Bertha's quiet prayers. It came from Rome. The story goes that Pope Gregory the Great, before he was pope, was walking through a slave market in Rome. He saw some fair-haired, fair-skinned boys for sale. Struck by their appearance, he asked where they were from. "They are Angles," the slave trader replied. Gregory, clearly enjoying a good pun, responded, "Not angles, but angels." Whether this actually happened or is just a bit of monkish propaganda, the sentiment was real. Gregory wanted to reclaim the lost province of Britannia for the church. He didn't send an army. He sent a monk named Augustine. And frankly, Augustine was terrified. He and his party of missionaries traveled through France, hearing horror stories about the ferocious, barbarous English who would surely skin them alive. Augustine actually got so scared, he turned back to Rome and asked the Pope to let him off the hook. Gregory essentially said, "Don't be a baby, go north." So, in 597 AD, nearly 50 years after Hengist and Horsa landed, Augustine's ships beached on the Isle of Thanet. It is a beautiful historical rhyme. The priests landed at the exact same spot as the mercenaries. Rome had returned, but this time the invaders weren't carrying gladiuses and shields. They were carrying silver crosses and painted boards depicting the face of Christ. King Ethelbert heard that these strange men had arrived. He was a prudent man. He didn't slaughter them, but he didn't welcome them with open arms either. He was deeply suspicious of their magic. In the Germanic worldview, spells and curses were very real threats. He agreed to meet Augustine, but only outdoors. The belief was that if you met a sorcerer under a roof, he could use the enclosed space to bind your mind. Out in the open air, under the vast grey sky of Kent, the old gods could keep an eye on things. The meeting took place on a ridge, with the wind whipping through the grass. Augustine and his monks approached in a procession, singing litanies. Ethelbert sat on his portable throne, surrounded by his bodyguards, big men with ashwood spears and boar-crested helmets. It was the collision of two universes, the Mediterranean mind meeting the northern spirit. Augustine preached to the king. He spoke of salvation, of an eternal kingdom, and of a God who didn't demand blood sacrifice, but offered redemption. We don't know exactly what the translator said. Likely one of the Frankish interpreters Bertha had provided. But Ethelbert's response was a masterclass in diplomatic caution. He said effectively, "Your words are fair, but they are new and uncertain. I cannot forsake the beliefs I have observed with the whole English nation for so long. But since you have come from far away to share what you believe to be true, we will not harm you. We will give you a house in Canterbury and food." It was the soft opening of Christianity. Ethelbert gave them permission to preach, but he didn't convert. Not yet. He watched them. He watched how they lived. They were simple, pious, and annoying only in their persistence. They occupied a small section of Canterbury, the king's capital, which was really just a collection of timber huts built inside the crumbling stone walls of the old Roman city. Over time, the resistance melted. Maybe it was Bertha's influence. Maybe it was the political advantage of aligning with the powerful kingdoms of the continent. Or maybe Ethelbert actually believed. Whatever the reason, the King of Kent stepped into the font and was baptized. When a king converts, the gravity of the kingdom shifts. Thousands of his subjects followed his lead. It wasn't necessarily a forced conversion by the sword. Ethelbert famously said that the service of Christ should be voluntary. But if you wanted a job in the administration or a favor from the king, it certainly helped to be on the same team as his new god. The consequences of this moment were staggering. Augustine was made the first Archbishop of Canterbury, establishing a seat of power that exists to this very day. He founded a monastery outside the walls, St. Augustine's Abbey, where the kings of Kent would be buried. The Jutes, once the destroyers of Roman order, were now its heirs. But the most significant thing Ethelbert did wasn't building a church. It was writing a list. With the help of the missionaries, he drafted the Code of Ethelbert. It was the first code of law written in any Germanic language. Before this, laws were memorized by elders. Now, they were ink on parchment. If you read the code, it's wonderfully specific and tells us exactly what life was like in early Kent. It's mostly a list of fines for various injuries. If you cut off a man's thumb, you owe him 20 shillings. If you cut off his shooting finger, it's 8 shillings. If you grab a woman by the hair, that's 50 satyrs. It's a society trying to regulate its own violence, putting a price tag on anger so that feuds don't spiral out of control. The document itself is a hybrid. It's written in the alphabet of the Romans, but the language is Old English, and the concepts are pure Germanic custom. It marks the moment the English civilization really begins to synthesize. The wild energy of the migration era was being tamed, categorized, and filed away by the influence of the church. By the time Ethelbert died in 616 AD, Kent was the beacon of the island. It had a cathedral, a library, and a direct line to the Pope. The darkness of the post-Roman collapse was lifting, but the light didn't reach everywhere. While Kent was singing hymns and drinking wine, the other kingdoms were still very much locked in the old ways. To the west of Kent, in the dense forests and coastal plains, another group of settlers had established themselves. They were the South Saxons, a people who would remain stubbornly enigmatic and isolated for generations. While Ethelbert was building a bridge to Europe, the South Saxons were building a fortress of silence. And before Ethelbert became the overlord, there was another man, a shadowy warlord who claimed the title of the very first Bretwalda. His story is harder to see through the fog, but it is where we must go next. We leave the civilized, chant-filled streets of Canterbury and head west, into the Weald, into the territory of the mysterious Isla and the Kingdom of Sussex. If you were to walk west from Ethelbert's civilized, psalm-singing capital of Canterbury, you wouldn't get very far before you hit a wall. Not a wall of stone, but a wall of trees. In the 6th and 7th centuries, the southeast of England was bisected by a forest so vast, so dense, and so utterly terrifying that it practically functioned as an inland sea. This was the Andredswield, the Forest of Undred. It stretched for over 100 miles, a tangle of ancient oaks, briars, and shadows where wolves hunted and outlaws disappeared. It was a natural barrier that cut off the southern coast from the rest of the island, creating a pocket of isolation that would become one of the most mysterious kingdoms of the Heptarchy, Sussex. The kingdom of the South Saxons is the enigma of early English history, while Northumbria has its great libraries and Wessex has its dynasty of kings. Sussex often feels like the quiet neighbor who keeps their blinds drawn and refuses to answer the door. They were the last to convert to Christianity, holding on to the old gods long after the rest of the island had moved on. But before they faded into this obscure isolation, they burst onto the scene with a violence that earned their leader the title of the very first Bretwalda. His name was Aelle. If Hengist was the opportunistic mercenary, Aelle was the hammer. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that laundry list of battles and deaths, tells us he arrived in the year 477 AD. He didn't come alone. He brought his 3 sons, Seaman, Blenking, and Sissa, and 3 ships full of warriors. They landed at a place called Seamanshora, likely near Selseybill on the modern West Sussex coast. Imagine the scene on that beach. The keels grinding into the shingle, the shouts of men hauling gear through the surf. The chronicle tells us that the moment they hit the sand, they were in a fight. The local Britons, desperate and entrenched, swarmed down to meet them. But Aelle was not a man to be pushed back into the sea. He slaughtered many of the defenders and drove the rest into the Great Wood, that looming dark forest we just mentioned. From the very start, Aelle's campaign was different. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an extermination. He spent the next decade slowly grinding his way east along the coast, pushing the British forces back, mile by bloody mile. He wasn't interested in ruling over a submissive British population. He was carving out a new homeland for his people, the South Saxons. The climax of this brutal conquest came in 491 AD. Aelle and his son Sissa marched their army to the walls of Underitum. Today, we know it as Pevensey Castle. If you visit Pevensey now, you see a strange hybrid, a medieval castle built inside the massive, brooding shell of a Roman shore fort. Those outer walls are Roman. They are thick, towering, and seemingly indestructible. In 491, they were the last refuge for the Britons of the south coast. The siege of Underitum is one of the few events where the chronicle drops its dry, factual tone and gives us a glimpse of total horror. The Britons had retreated inside the fort, relying on Roman engineering to save them. But Roman walls need Roman logistics to work. Cut off from food, surrounded by Aelle's shouting, shield-banging warriors, the defenders were trapped. We don't know how long the siege lasted. We can imagine the hunger, the thirst, the arrows arcing over the walls day and night. Eventually, the defenses failed. Maybe a gate was smashed. Maybe ladders were raised. The Saxons poured in. What followed was a massacre that echoed through the centuries. The chronicle states, with chilling simplicity, Aelle and Sissa besieged Underitum and slew all that dwelt therein, so that not a single Briton was there left. It wasn't a victory, it was an erasure. Aelle wiped the slate clean. This brutality is likely why Bede, writing centuries later in his peaceful monastery, lists Aelle as the first king to hold imperium over the southern English provinces. He was the first Bretwalda. It's a title that implies a wide ruler or Britain ruler. It doesn't mean he was the King of England in a legal sense, but it means he was the alpha dog. He was the warlord that other warlords were afraid of. For a brief window in the late 5th century, if you lived south of the Humber, you knew the name Aella. But here is where the mystery deepens. After the bloodbath at Pevensey, Aella and his kingdom effectively vanish from the narrative. The spotlight moves away. The South Saxons, having carved out their territory, seem to have turned inward. The geography is the key to this silence. The Kingdom of Sussex was a strip of fertile coastal land trapped between the sea and the Andredsveld. Once they had killed or driven out the Britons, they had nowhere else to go. They couldn't expand north because of the forest. They couldn't go west or east without hitting other Saxon or Jute settlements. So they stayed put. They became a cultural Galapagos, while Kent was trading with Franks and drinking wine, and while the northern kingdoms were forming great alliances, Sussex stewed in its own isolation. It became a land of deep, conservative paganism. It was a place where the old ways didn't just survive, they calcified. We have almost no names of Sussex kings after Aella for nearly 200 years. It's a historical blackout. They are there, farming the South Downs, fishing in the Channel, and presumably fighting amongst themselves. But they don't bother the rest of history, and history doesn't bother them. They are the wild men of the South, living in the shadow of their terrifying founder. There is a theory, whispered by some historians and shouted by storytellers, that Aella's sudden disappearance from the record might be connected to another legend. The timing of Aella's dominance, the late 5th century, overlaps perfectly with the supposed reign of King Arthur. Some have suggested that the Battle of Mountbatten, the great British victory that stopped the Saxon advance for a generation, was fought against Aella. If true, it would explain why Sussex suddenly stopped expanding. They didn't just stop, they were stopped. They were smashed so hard by a British counterattack that they retreated behind the Andredsveld and didn't come out for a century. Whether or not Aella faced Arthur is a riddle we'll never solve. But the legacy of Aella is undeniable. He proved that the Roman defenses could be broken. He proved that the Saxons were here to stay. And he established the concept of the Bretwalda, the idea that one king could, and perhaps should, be superior to the others. It was an idea that would haunt the Heptarchy for centuries, driving king after king to try and replicate Aella's dominance. But as the sun sets on the grim walls of Pevensey, leaving the South Saxons to their brooding isolation, we look further west. The Saxon shore was becoming crowded. The Jutes had Kent. The South Saxons had Sussex. But the biggest wave was yet to crash. Ships were spotted in the Solent, the stretch of water between the Isle of Wight and the mainland. Another warlord was coming. His name was Cerdic. He was about to start something that wouldn't just be a kingdom. It would be a dynasty. Aella may have been the first to claim the title of Bretwalda, but Cerdic was planting the seeds of the monarchy that still sits on the throne today. The West Saxons were arriving, and they were bringing a whole new level of ambition to the party. If history is a theatre, then the arrival of the West Saxons is the moment the main character finally walks onto the stage. They're late. The party has been going on for nearly 50 years. The Jutes are already drinking wine in Kent. Aella has already slaughtered the garrison at Pevensey. But when the West Saxons finally show up, they aren't just looking for a seat at the table. They are looking to buy the building. The year is 495 AD. We are moving west along the coast, past the silence of the South Saxons, into the choppy waters of the Solent, the channel separating the Isle of Wight from the mainland. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, 5 ships appear on the horizon. They slide into the mud at a place the chroniclers call Serdis Azora, or Serdic's Shore. We don't know exactly where this is today. Maybe Calshot, maybe somewhere near Southampton Water. But the location matters less than the man standing at the prow of the lead ship. His name is Serdic, and immediately we have a problem. If you are a Germanic warlord leading a band of rough Saxons from the continent, you should be named something like Wulfstan, or Hrothgar, or Ethel something. But Serdic isn't a Germanic name, it's Brittonic. It's a version of the name Caraticus or Cedric. It would be like meeting a samurai named Steve. It just doesn't fit the profile. This linguistic anomaly is one of the most delicious mysteries in British history. Why does the founder of the greatest Saxon kingdom have a British name? Was he actually a native Briton, perhaps a local noble, who saw which way the wind was blowing, adopted Saxon customs, and hired a bunch of mercenaries to carve out a kingdom for himself? Or was his mother a British captive who gave him a name from her own people? It suggests that the invasion wasn't as black and white as we think. It wasn't just Team Saxon versus Team Britain. It was a messy, fluid frontier where identities blurred. Serdic represents that blur. He is a man of two worlds, leading a Germanic army, but carrying a name that echoes the Roman past. Serdic didn't come alone. He brought his son, Cynric. Together, they stepped onto the Hampshire mud and started doing what warlords do. But unlike Aella, who swept through Sussex like a forest fire, Serdic's progress was slow, painfully slow. The chronicle entries for the early West Saxons are spaced out by years, even decades. They fought a battle here, captured a ford there. This wasn't a blitzkrieg, it was a grind. They were fighting for the Hampshire Basin, a landscape of tidal marshes, thick forests, and Roman ruins. The Britons here were organized. They weren't just fleeing refugees. They were led by a king named Natan Leod. In 528 AD, 13 years after landing, Serdic and Cynric finally met Natan Leod in a decisive clash. The chronicle tells us that Natan Leod was killed, along with 5,000 of his men. The place was named Natanlig, Netley Marsh, in his memory. It's a grim tribute to have the land named after you, only because that's where you died fighting for it. With Natan Leod gone, the West Saxons, the Gevisse, as they called themselves then, began to push inland. They weren't just raiding anymore. They were settling. They took Winchester, the old Roman city of Venta Belgarum. Winchester is important. It sits in a valley like a jewel. The Romans loved it, and the West Saxons would eventually make it the capital of England. When Turdic walked into Winchester, pushing past the weeds and the rubble, he was walking into the future center of his dynasty's power. But let's pause and look at the map. By the early 6th century, Serdic's people controlled a triangle of land in central southern England. It wasn't huge. Compared to the powerful kingdom of Kent, Wessex was a backwater. It was the Wild West of the Heptarchy. The soil was chalky, the borders were undefined, and they were constantly skirmishing with the Britons to the west and other Saxons to the east. Yet, Cerdic possesses a weapon more powerful than any spear or shield. He has a genealogy. In the centuries that followed, the kingdom of Wessex would grow. It would swallow Sussex, absorb Kent, and conquer Mercia. It would produce Alfred the Great, and every single one of those kings would trace their line back, name by name, begat by begat, to Cerdic. He became the anchor of legitimacy. Even today, if you trace the lineage of King Charles III back through the twisted branches of the family tree, past the Tudors, past the Plantagenets, past the Normans, past the House of Wessex, you eventually end up at Cerdic, standing in the mud in 495 AD. He is the patient zero of the English monarchy. Cerdic died in 534 AD. He didn't die in a blaze of glory like a tragic hero, nor was he murdered at a feast. He just died, likely an old man, leaving the kingdom to Cynric. The foundation was poured. The concrete was wet, but it was setting. Under Cynric and his son, Ceawlin, the West Saxons kept pushing. They were relentless. They fought their way north to the Thames Valley and west toward the River Severn. They were the hungry dogs of the Heptarchy, always looking for the next scrap of land. They captured Old Sarum, that ancient hill fort near modern Salisbury. They captured Bath, the Roman spa town, though by then the hot springs were likely bubbling up through cracked masonry and weeds. But while Wessex was scrapping for territory in the south, something glittering was rising in the east. If Wessex was the land of grit and slow conquest, East Anglia was becoming the land of gold and sudden, blinding power. The narrative torch passes now from the chalk downs of Hampshire to the flat, misty fens of the eastern coast. In the lands of the East Angles, modern Norfolk and Suffolk, a new dynasty was flexing its muscles. These people were Swedes, or cousins of the Swedes, the Geats from the world of Beowulf. They loved ships, they loved treasure, and they were about to produce a king who would overshadow everyone else in the Heptarchy. While Cerdic's descendants were fighting muddy skirmishes in the woods, the king of East Anglia was commissioning a burial that would stun the world 14 centuries later. We are leaving the pragmatism of Wessex and entering the era of the spectacular. We are heading to the court of King Raedwald and the ghost ship of Sutton Hoo. If you drive northeast from London today, the landscape eventually flattens out. The hills dissolve, the horizon drops, and the sky becomes massive. You are entering East Anglia, the counties of Norfolk and Suffolk. In the early 7th century, this was a world of water and sky, a labyrinth of marshes, fens, and slow-moving rivers. It was a place where the boundary between the land and the sea was negotiable. And it was here, amidst the reeds and the mist, that the Heptarchy produced perhaps its most glamorous and enigmatic king. His name was Raedwald. Raedwald belonged to a dynasty called the Woffingas. It translates to the people of the wolf. It's a name that sounds like it should be scrawled on the side of a Viking longship. And that's not a coincidence. The Woffingas didn't look south to Rome or west to the Britons for their cultural cues. They looked east, across the North Sea to Sweden. Their genealogy and their art suggest they were cousins of the Geats, the very people celebrated in the epic poem Beowulf. Raedwald wasn't just a local English king. He was a Scandinavian warlord operating a franchise in Suffolk. By 616 AD, Ethelbert of Kent, the first Christian king we met earlier, had died. With his death, the title of Bretwalda, the Briton ruler, was up for grabs. It didn't go to his son. It didn't go to the West Saxons. It went to Redwald. For a brief, shining moment, the center of gravity in England shifted to the East Anglian coast. Redwald is a fascinating character because he is so wonderfully human in his indecision. He is the patron saint of hedging your bets. He traveled to Kent and was baptized as a Christian, likely to keep his powerful neighbors happy. But when he came home to East Anglia, his wife, whose name, tragically, history has failed to record, had a few words with him. She was evidently a formidable woman who preferred the old gods. She scolded him for abandoning the traditions of his ancestors. So, Redwald came up with a compromise that feels almost like a modern political solution. In his great temple, he set up two altars. On one, he offered the bread and wine of the Christian Mass. On the other, he sacrificed oxen to Woden. Bede, the monk historian, writes about this with palpable disgust, calling it foolishness. But from Redwald's perspective, it was genius. Why choose one divine insurance policy when you can afford two? If Christ didn't show up, maybe Woden would. It was spiritual diversification. But Redwald wasn't just a theological pragmatist. He was a warrior. His defining moment came not in a church, but on the battlefield. A fugitive prince from the north named Edwin came to Redwald's court seeking asylum. The current king of Northumbria, a man named Ethelfrith, wanted Edwin dead and sent messengers to Redwald offering a massive pile of gold if he would kill the guest. If Redwald refused, the messengers promised war. Redwald was tempted. He actually agreed to kill Edwin. It was the easy, profitable choice. But once again, his wife stepped in. She told him that it was beneath the dignity of a king to sell a friend for gold. Shamed by his queen, Redwald did a 180-degree turn. He didn't just refuse to kill Edwin. He raised his army and marched north to fight for him. They met at the Battle of the River Idle in 616 AD. It was a messy fight in the mud of Nottinghamshire. Redwald's son, Reganhare, was killed in the chaos. But Redwald won. He slew the Northumbrian king and placed his friend Edwin on the throne. It was the high water mark of East Anglian power. Redwald was now the kingmaker of England. But the reason we remember Redwald today isn't really because of the River Idle. It's because of what happened when he died around 624 AD. His people didn't just dig a hole. They staged a piece of theater that was intended to echo through eternity. They took a ship, a 90-foot-long seagoing vessel made of oak, and they dragged it up a hill from the River Deben. This was a massive undertaking. Imagine the sweat, the ropes, the logs used as rollers, the shouting of men hauling this leviathan up the slope to a place we now call Sutton Hoo. They dug a trench in the sandy soil and lowered the ship into it. Inside the hull, they built a wooden chamber, a house for the dead. And then they filled it. They didn't just leave him with a sword and a shield. They surrounded him with a hoard of treasure that was frankly obscene in its richness. They laid out gold shoulder clasps inlaid with garnets that fit together with such geometric perfection it looks like computer-aided design. These garnets came from India or Sri Lanka, proving that even in the so-called Dark Ages, the trade networks were vast. They placed silver bowls from Byzantium, a hanging bowl with Celtic designs, and a terrifyingly beautiful helmet with a face mask that has become the icon of the entire Anglo-Saxon era. The helmet is a masterpiece. It has iron eyebrows inlaid with silver wire. ending in boar heads. The nose and mouth formed the shape of a flying dragon. When the king wore this, he wasn't a man anymore. He was an idol. He was a statue of judgment. And then there's the mystery. When archaeologists excavated the ship in 1939, just as World War II was looming, another nice historical rhyme, they found all the treasure. They found the sword, the shield, the lyre, the feasting cauldrons. But they didn't find the king. There was no skeleton. For a long time, people thought it might be a cenotaph, a memorial for a king whose body was lost at sea. But modern soil analysis tells a different story. The soil at Sutton Hoo is incredibly acidic. It eats bone. The phosphate signature in the center of the burial chamber suggests that a body was indeed placed there. The king was there. The earth just reclaimed him completely. He dissolved into the sand, leaving his armor to hold the shape of a ghost. Was it Redwald? We can't be 100% sure, but he is the only candidate who fits the timeline and the grandeur. The mixture of Christian and pagan artifacts in the grave, silver spoons with Paul and Saul written on them lying next to pagan talismans, perfectly matches Redwald's two altars' personality. The burial at Sutton Hoo was a final, defiant shout of pagan grandeur before the twilight settled. It was the Wuffingus saying, "Look at us. Look at what we can build. Look at what we can bury." It is a snapshot of a kingdom at its absolute zenith, confident and dripping in gold. But glory in the Heptarchy is fleeting. With Redwald gone, the power of East Anglia began to wane. The moment was over. The great ship was covered with a mound of earth, disappearing from sight for 1,300 years. The local people forgot who was buried there, though the place name, Sutton Hoo, essentially means the southern ridge of the burial mounds. So the memory lingered in the geography, if not the history books. The mantle of power, the Imperium, didn't stay in the east. It traveled north, carried by the very man Redwald had saved. Edwin was no longer the fugitive prince shivering in the court of the Wuffingus. He was now the king of Northumbria. He had learned from Redwald's strength, but he had also seen the confusion of the dual altars. Edwin was a man looking for certainty. As the wind blows over the grassy mounds of Sutton Hoo, rustling the bracken where a ghost ship sleeps, we turn our eyes to the rugged, rocky lands of the north. Northumbria is waking up. It is about to become the powerhouse of the island, a place where the next great chapter of the English story, the clash between the Celtic and Roman churches, will be written in blood and ink. Edwin is waiting, and he is about to have a vision in the dark that will change everything. If you travel north from the flat, watery fens of East Anglia, the land eventually hardens. The earth rises up into the spine of the Pennines. The winds get sharper, and the coastline turns into a jagged sawtooth of granite and basalt. We are entering the north. In the 7th century, this wasn't England yet. It was a war zone called Northumbria. And before it was Northumbria, it was two wolves fighting over a carcass. The kingdoms of Bernicia and Deira. Bernicia was the northern chunk, stretching from the River Tyne up past the modern Scottish border to the Firth of Forth. Its heart was the impregnable rock fortress of Bamberg, a place that still looks like a fantasy illustration today. Deira was the southern chunk, centered around the old Roman city of York and the rolling wolds of East Yorkshire. For generations, these two houses hated each other more than they hated the Britons or the Picts. But one man was about to force them together into a super kingdom that would dominate the island. That man was Edwin. We met him briefly in the last section, shivering in exile at the court of Raedwald. Edwin was a prince of Dira, but he had spent his entire youth on the run, hunted by the rival house of Bernicia. He was the classic king over the water, the lost heir living out of a suitcase. But after Raedwald defeated his enemies at the Battle of the River Idle, Edwin didn't just go home. He took it all. He united Dira and Bernicia, creating the kingdom of Northumberland. Edwin was a new kind of king. He wasn't just a warlord, he was an administrator. Bede tells us that during Edwin's reign, a woman with a newborn babe could walk throughout the island from sea to sea without receiving any harm. That's the kind of propaganda historians love, but it points to a reality. Edwin brought order. He even had a standard-bearer walk before him when he rode through the streets, carrying a Roman-style banner called a tufa. He was bringing a touch of imperial flair to the Moors, but despite his power, Edwin was haunted. He was a man sitting on a fence, and the fence was getting uncomfortable. Like Ethelbert of Kent before him, Edwin married a Christian princess to secure an alliance. He married Ethelburga, the daughter of Ethelbert, and just like her mother Bertha, Ethelburga brought a bishop with her. His name was Paulinus. Bede gives us a physical description of Paulinus, which is rare and wonderful. He describes him as tall of stature, a little stooping, his hair black, his face thin, and his nose slender and aquiline. You can picture him, a gaunt, intense Italian intellectual wandering through the drafty wooden halls of York, looking at the rough northern warriors with a mixture of pity and determination. Paulinus badgered Edwin to convert. Ethelburga badgered Edwin to convert. The Pope even sent letters and gifts, a gold shirt and a silver mirror for the Queen, urging him to convert. But Edwin was stubborn. He was a thinker. He would sit alone for hours, brooding, weighing the old gods against the new. He needed a sign. He got two. The first was violent, the second was philosophical. The violence came from the south. The king of the West Saxons, a man named Kwickelm, decided he didn't like Edwin calling himself the overlord of Britain. So he sent an assassin. The assassin arrived at Edwin's royal villa on Easter Sunday, claiming to have a message. As he approached the throne, he drew a dagger from under his cloak. The dagger had been smeared with poison. It happened in a split second. One of Edwin's most loyal thegns, a man named Lila, saw the blade flash. He didn't have time to draw his sword. He didn't have a shield. So he threw his own body between the king and the knife. The assassin struck with such force that the dagger went through Lila's body and still wounded Edwin. Lila died instantly, the ultimate sacrifice of the Germanic comitatus loyalty. The assassin was hacked to pieces, but the point was made. Death is always one heartbeat away. Edwin survived the wound. He promised Paulinus that if the Christian God gave him victory over the West Saxons who sent the assassin, he would convert. He went to war. He smashed the West Saxons, but when he came back, he still hesitated. He was the ultimate procrastinator. Then came the second sign, the vision in the dark. Paulinus came to Edwin one day, laid his hand on the king's head, and asked if he remembered this sign. It triggered a memory from Edwin's exile. Years ago, when he was desperate and afraid he would be betrayed, a stranger had visited him in the night and told him, "I can save you, and I can make you a king, if you promise to follow my advice when the time comes." Edwin had promised. Paulinus now revealed that he was the agent of that promise. The bill had come due. Edwin called a council. This is one of the most cinematic scenes in all of Bede's history. The king gathered his wise men, his ealdormen, and his priests in a timber hall, probably near York. The fire was crackling in the center, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the winter wind was howling, and snow was driving against the thatch. Edwin asked them, "What do you think of this new doctrine?" One of his counselors stood up and gave an answer that is so beautiful, so melancholic, and so perfectly English that it has survived for 1,300 years. He said, "The present life of man, O king, seems to me like to the swift flight of a sparrow through the room wherein you sit at supper in winter. The fire is burning on the hearth, and the hall is warm, while without, the winter rain and snow are raging. The sparrow, flying in at one door and immediately out at another, whilst he is within, is safe from the wintry storm. But after a short space of fair weather, he immediately vanishes out of your sight, into the dark winter from which he had emerged. So this life of man appears for a short space, but of what went before, or what is to follow, we are utterly ignorant. If, therefore, this new doctrine contains something more certain, it seems justly to deserve to be followed." It's a stunning metaphor. Life is just a brief flash of warmth and light between two eternal darknesses. The pagan gods offered strength and luck, but they didn't explain the darkness. Christianity claimed it could. Then, things got rowdy. The high priest of the pagan gods, a man named Coifi, stood up. You'd expect the high priest to defend the old ways, but Coifi was a pragmatist. He basically said, "Look, I've served these gods more faithfully than anyone, and look at me. I'm not the richest guy here. If the gods were real, they would have helped me more. I say we burn them." Coifi demanded a stallion and a spear. This was taboo. Priests were only allowed to ride mares and couldn't carry weapons. He rode straight to the great pagan temple at Goodmanham, just east of York. The crowd thought he had gone mad. He galloped up to the shrine and hurled the spear straight into it. The spell was broken. No lightning bolt struck him down. The gods were silent. The people, seeing their priest desecrate the sanctuary with no consequences, rushed in and burned the temple to the ground. Edwin was baptized at York in a small wooden church hastily built for the occasion, the site of the current York Minster. It was the year 627 AD. Northumbria was officially Christian. For a few years, it looked like the Golden Age had arrived. Edwin was the most powerful man in Britain. He ruled over Britons, Scots, and English alike. He had the favor of Rome. He had the loyalty of his people. But in the Heptarchy, the wheel always turns. While Edwin was basking in the light of his new faith, a darkness was gathering in the Midlands. A new king had risen in the kingdom of Mercia. His name was Penda. And unlike Coifi, Penda had no interest in burning his gods. He liked his gods just fine. They were gods of war, and Penda was very, very good at war. Penda allied himself with Cadwallon, a British king from Wales, who hated Edwin for his own reasons. Together, the pagan Saxon and the Christian Briton marched north. They were an odd couple, united by a common enemy. They met Edwin at the Battle of Hatfield Chase in 633 AD. It was a slaughter. The peace where a woman could walk unharmed was shattered. Edwin, the great Bretwalda, the man who saw the sparrow fly through the hall, was killed. His head was cut off, and taken to York. His son was killed. The Northumbrian army was annihilated. Ethelburga and Paulinus fled back to Kent by ship, taking the royal children and the church plate with them. The golden age of Northumbria collapsed overnight. The kingdom split back into Bernicia and Deira. The altars were smashed. The brief warmth of the hall was gone, and the sparrow was back in the storm. It seemed like the experiment was over. Christianity had failed in the north. The pagan warlords were back in charge. But on the rocky coast of Scotland, on a small island called Iona, the monks were watching, and hiding among them was another prince, an exile from the house of Bernicia. He was young, he was pious, and he had a very strong right arm. His name was Oswald, and he was coming to take back the north, not with a Roman bishop, but with a Celtic cross. The year following Edwin's death was so horrific that later chroniclers decided to simply delete it from the calendar. They called it the Hateful Year. It was a time when the petty kings who tried to replace Edwin reverted to paganism, only to be hunted down and butchered by Cadwallon, the British king who was tearing through Northumbria like a wolf in a sheep pen. The north was broken, bleeding, and leaderless, but help was coming from the edge of the world. While Edwin had been ruling from York, his rivals, the sons of the previous king Ethelfrith, had been hiding in the mist-shrouded islands of the Hebrides, specifically at the monastery of Iona. This is a crucial detail. They weren't hiding in the courts of other Saxon kings. They were living with Irish monks. They learned Gaeilge, Irish. They learned the rhythm of the tides, and they learned a version of Christianity that was very different from the Roman pomp of Canterbury. It was wilder, simpler, and intimately connected to nature. The leader of these exiles was Oswald. In 634 AD, Oswald returned. He didn't bring a massive army. He likely had only a small warband of faithful retainers, and perhaps some Scots or Pictish mercenaries. But he had conviction. He marched south to face Cadwallon, the man who had seemed invincible. They met at a place near Hexham, close to the old Hadrian's Wall. The night before the battle, Oswald did something that would become iconic in English art. He ordered a wooden cross to be made. He dug the hole for it himself. As his men watched, their king, a warrior with the reputation of a giant, stepped into the hole to hold the timber upright while his soldiers backed the earth around it. He told them to kneel and pray to the living and true God. The next morning, they attacked. It wasn't a siege, it was a storm. Despite being outnumbered, Oswald's force shattered the British army. Cadwallon, the scourge of the north, was chased down and killed by a brook called the Dennisburn. The field was renamed Heavenfield. The victory was total. The hateful year was over. Oswald was now king of Northumbria. He reunited Bernicia and Deira, just as Edwin had, but he was a different kind of man. He was known as Lamengin, White Blade. The nickname implies a shining, terrifying purity. He was a warrior saint, a man who could cleave a skull in the morning and translate a sermon in the afternoon. And he needed to translate, because the first thing Oswald did wasn't to call the Roman bishop Paulinus back from Kent. He didn't want the guys who fled. He wanted the men who stayed. He sent a message to his old friends at Iona. Send me a bishop. The monks at Iona sent a man named Corman. It didn't go well. Corman was severe, austere, and completely lacked people skills. He preached at the Northumbrians, told them They were stubborn barbarians, and when they didn't immediately convert, he packed his bags and went back to Iona in a huff. He reported to the Council of Elders that the English were ungovernable. Sitting in that council meeting was a monk named Aidan. He listened to Corman's rant and then spoke up gently. "Brother," he said, "it seems to me that you were too severe on your ignorant hearers. You should have followed the practice of the apostles and given them the milk of more easy doctrine first, until they were capable of greater things." The council looked at Aidan, they looked at each other, and they said, "You go." Aidan arrived in Northumbria in 635 AD. Oswald offered him a seat at York, the traditional Roman capital. Aidan politely refused. He didn't want a stone city. He wanted a place that reminded him of Iona, somewhere quiet, somewhere close to the sea, somewhere the veil between heaven and earth felt thin. He chose Lindisfarne. If you've never been to Lindisfarne or Holy Island, it is a place of moody, shifting magic. Twice a day, the tide rushes in over the causeway, cutting the island off from the mainland. It is a fortress of solitude. From this windswept rock, Aidan launched a spiritual invasion of England that was far more successful than any military campaign. The partnership between King Oswald and Bishop Aidan is one of the most touching relationships in history. They were the ultimate dynamic duo. Aidan didn't speak English well. He spoke Irish. Oswald, having spent his youth in exile, spoke fluent Irish. So, they would travel together. Aidan would preach to the crowds in his native tongue, and the King of Northumbria, the most powerful warlord in Britain, would stand beside him and translate for his own earls and peasants. It's a powerful image, the warrior king serving as the voice for the humble monk. Aidan was everything the Roman bishops weren't. He refused to ride a horse. He walked everywhere, sloshing through the mud to talk to the poorest farmers. When wealthy people gave him money, he used it to buy the freedom of slaves. He was kind, he was patient, and he was undeniably holy. The people of the north, who had been skeptical of the rich Roman priests, fell in love with Aidan. Under Oswald and Aidan, Northumbria entered a golden age that felt different from Edwin's. It wasn't about imperial banners. It was about art, learning, and fusion. The artistic style that emerged, the insular style, blended the swirling, geometric patterns of the Celtic West with the heavy, animal-focused designs of the Germanic East. This is the world that would eventually produce the Lindisfarne Gospels. It was a cultural renaissance on the edge of the world. Legend clings to Oswald like moss on a stone. There is a famous story where Oswald and Aidan were feasting at Easter. A silver dish of dainties was placed before the king. Just then, a servant whispered that a crowd of starving poor was begging outside. Oswald immediately ordered the food to be given to them. And then he took the silver dish and ordered it to be broken up and distributed as alms. Aidan, moved by this act of charity, seized Oswald's right hand and exclaimed, "May this hand never perish." It's the kind of thing you say in the heat of the moment, but the legend says it came true. Years later, after Oswald was dead and his body was, let's say, redistributed, his right hand was kept in a silver casket at Bamberg, uncorrupted, refusing to rot. For 8 years, Oswald was the Bretwalder. He dominated the island. The other kingdoms acknowledged his supremacy. He was the ideal king, strong in battle, humble in faith, generous to the poor. He seemed untouchable. But there is a rule in the Heptarchy. If you are a Northumbrian king, your doom is waiting in the Midlands. While Oswald was building churches and translating sermons, the old wolf was still prowling. Penda of Mercia was not done. He had killed Edwin. He had ravaged the north once, and he looked at Oswald's Christian kingdom with deep, abiding suspicion. Penda was the last great pagan. He wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a traditionalist. He saw these new kings bowing to a foreign god, a god of peace, and turning the other cheek. And he saw weakness. He saw a betrayal of the warrior code that had brought their ancestors across the sea. Penda didn't fight for territory. He fought for hegemony. He fought to prove that Woden was stronger than Christ. The tension built. It was inevitable. Two superpowers cannot coexist in a space as small as England. In 642 AD, the storm broke again. Oswald, perhaps overconfident, perhaps feeling the pull of destiny, marched south. He ventured deep into Penda's territory, into the borderlands near the Welsh frontier. The location was a place called Field. We think it's near modern Oswestry, Oswald's Tree, in Shropshire. It was a long way from the safety of the Holy Island. We don't know the tactical details of the battle. We only know the outcome. The White Blade was broken. Penda's army, likely bolstered by Welsh allies again, overwhelmed the Northumbrians. Oswald, the saintly king, was surrounded. The legends say he died praying for the souls of his soldiers. God have mercy on their souls, said Oswald, as he fell to the earth. But Penda wasn't interested in mercy. He wanted to send a message. He wanted to show the world that this Christian God couldn't protect his favorite son. After the battle, Penda ordered Oswald's body to be butchered. He cut off the head and the arms and mounted them on wooden stakes. It was a ritual sacrifice to Woden, a grisly trophy display reminiscent of the old Germanic forests. For a year, the birds pecked at the remains of the Bretwalda. It seemed like history was repeating itself. Another Christian king dead. Another Northumbrian army destroyed. The pagan warlord, Penda, standing triumphant over the ruin. But something was different this time. When Edwin died, his church fled. When Oswald died, his church stayed. Aidan didn't back up. The monks at Lindisfarne wept, but they didn't leave. They retrieved Oswald's head, which eventually ended up in St. Cuthbert's coffin, a story for later, and his hands. They declared him a martyr. Penda had killed the man, but he had inadvertently created a saint. The cult of St. Oswald spread across Europe. He became the model of Christian kingship. However, in the immediate, bloody reality of 642 AD, the North was in trouble. Penda was the undisputed master of England. He was old, he was terrifying, and he was undefeated. He would spend the next decade tearing at the seams of every Christian kingdom in sight. He is the antagonist of the 7th century, the unstoppable force of the old world, and he is the subject of our next section. We have to look at this man Penda, not just as a killer, but as a king who held the Heptarchy in his iron grip for 30 years, refusing to let the new age begin. History is written by the victors, which usually means it's written by the people who know how to write. In 7th century England, that meant Christian monks, and to the monks, Penda of Mercia was the boogeyman. Bede calls him wicked and heathen every chance he gets. But if you strip away the monastic bias, Penda emerges as one of the most formidable, consistent, and frankly impressive figures of the entire age. He was the last great pagan, the old oak tree that refused to fall, while the rest of the forest was being replanted with foreign pines. Mercia itself was the land of the border people, the Meas. It occupied the Midlands, a massive, nebulous territory sandwiched between the Welsh mountains to the west, the Northumbrian moors to the north, and the West Saxon chalk to the south. It was the crossroads of the island, and for 30 years, Penda sat in the middle of it, like a spider in a web, pulling strings that made kings dance. What's terrifying about Penda isn't just his violence, it's his longevity. According to some sources, he was already 50 years old when he became king in 626 AD. If that's true, he was fighting battles in his 70s, hacking through shield walls when most men were groaning about their knees. He was the terminator of the Heptarchy. He didn't just defeat kings, he deleted them. We've already seen him kill Edwin of Northumbria at Hatfield Chase. We've seen him butcher Oswald at Maserfield. But Penda wasn't satisfied with just decapitating Northumbrians. He turned his eyes east to East Anglia. The East Anglian kings, Sigebert and Ecgric, tried to stand against him. Penda killed them both in the same battle. A few years later, another East Anglian king, Anna, tried to resist. Penda killed him too. He then turned south to Wessex. The king of the West Saxons, Cenwalh, made the mistake of divorcing Penda's sister. You do not divorce Penda's sister. Penda invaded Wessex, drove Cenwalh into exile for 3 years, and effectively reminded the West Saxons that they existed only because he allowed it. By the 650s, Penda was the undeniable overlord of England, but he was a complex villain. He wasn't a religious fanatic in the way the Christian kings were. He didn't burn churches just to be mean. In fact, he allowed Christian missionaries to preach in Mercia. He even allowed his own son, Beada, to convert to Christianity, to marry a Northumbrian princess. Bede, who hates Penda, grudgingly admits that Penda only despised one thing: hypocrisy. He hated Christians who didn't live up to their own rules. He reportedly said he had scorn for those who, after they had obeyed the name of Christ, did not care to do his works. In Penda's world, if you swear an oath to a god, you keep it. He stuck to Woden because Woden was honest about what he was: a god of war, wisdom, and death. Penda understood that. He found the Christian god a bit confusing, but he respected those who served him faithfully. But the friction was building. The Northumbrians were recovering from the disaster of Maserfield. Oswald's younger brother, Oswiu, had taken the throne of Bernicia. Oswiu was a survivor. He had spent years trying to rebuild his shattered kingdom, while Penda raided it every summer, like it was a seasonal hobby. Penda would march north, burn the crops, besiege Bamberg, fail to take the rock, and march home. It was a humiliating annual ritual for Oswiu. In 655 AD, Penda decided to finish the job. He was an old man now, perhaps nearing 80, but his appetite for destruction was undiminished. He gathered a massive coalition. He called in his Welsh allies, led by Cadafael. He called in the East Anglians. He even called in the king of Deira, Ethelwald, who was supposed to be Oswiu's ally, but decided to back the winner. This army was described as 30 legions. A poetic exaggeration, perhaps, but it signifies a force of overwhelming size. They marched north to destroy Oswiu once and for all. Oswiu retreated to a fortress, possibly near Stirling in Scotland, or perhaps in North Yorkshire. The geography is disputed. He was desperate. He offered Penda a treasure hoard so vast it was legendary. He offered to strip the gold from every church and hall in Bernicia if Penda would just go home. Some sources say Penda took the gold and distributed it to his allies, then attacked anyway. Others say he refused it outright because he didn't want gold. He wanted Oswio's head. Either way, the negotiations failed. Oswio, with his back to the wall and a tiny army, made a vow. He said, "If the pagan will not accept our gifts, let us offer them to him who will, the Lord our God." He promised to give his daughter to the church as a nun and to donate 12 estates to build monasteries if he won. The two armies met at a place called the Wynwade. We don't know exactly where this river is today. Most likely the river went in Yorkshire. But we know what the weather was like. It was November. It was raining, the kind of relentless, freezing English rain that turns the world into soup. The river was swollen, bursting its banks, a churning torrent of brown water. As the battle lines formed, the cracks in Penda's coalition appeared. The Welsh king, Cadafael, took one look at the situation. Maybe he sensed the doom, or maybe he was just tired of dying for Penda, and he marched his army away in the night. The Welsh later gave him the nickname Cadafael the Battle Dodger. The king of Deira, Ethelwald, also decided to sit this one out, withdrawing his troops to a safe distance to watch who won. Suddenly, the 30 legions weren't so invincible. Penda was exposed. Oswiu attacked. It was a desperate charge of the few against the many. But the morale of the Mercian army collapsed. Maybe it was the betrayal of their allies. Maybe it was the divine fury of the Northumbrians. Or maybe it was just the mud. The pagan shield wall broke. The slaughter was immense. But the chronicle tells us that more died in the river than by the sword. The fleeing Mercians were pushed back into the swollen Wynwade. Armor is heavy. The current was strong. The river swallowed the last great pagan army of England. And there, amidst the chaos and the rising water, Penda fell. We don't have a heroic death scene for him. No final speech. The old wolf, who had lived by the sword for 3 decades, likely died drowning in the mud of a flooded Yorkshire stream. His death marked the end of an era. With Penda gone, aggressive political paganism in England died. He was the dam that had held back the floodwaters of Christianity in the Midlands. When he broke, the water rushed in. His son Peada became the first Christian king of Mercia. His other children became saints. The irony is thick. The blood of the greatest pagan warlord watered the seeds of the Mercian church. Oswiu was now the Bretwalda. He was the undisputed master of Britain, having done what his brother Oswald and King Edwin could not. He had slain the dragon, but the victory at the Wynwade didn't solve everything. In fact, it created a new, more subtle problem. Now that everyone was technically Christian, they had to decide which kind of Christian they were going to be. For decades, there had been a slow-burning tension between the two branches of the faith. On one side, you had the Roman faction, centered in Kent and supported by the continental connection. They liked structure, hierarchy, bishops with nice hats, and calculating Easter according to the tables of the Pope. On the other side, you had the Celtic or Irish faction, centered in Northumbria at Lindisfarne. They were the spiritual descendants of Aidan and Oswald. They were monastic, wandering, ascetic, and they calculated Easter using an older, different calendar. This might sound like a minor administrative dispute to us, like arguing over whether to use Outlook or Google Calendar. But in the 7th century, it was huge. It meant that in the royal household of Northumbria, the king, raised by the Irish, and the queen, raised in Kent, were literally celebrating Easter on different days. While the king was feasting and shouting, "Hallelujah, he is risen," the queen was still fasting for Palm Sunday. It was a logistical and spiritual nightmare. If the kingdom was going to be united, if the soul of the English people was going to be coherent, they had to pick a team. They couldn't have two calendars and two tonsures, haircuts. Yes, even the haircuts were an issue. The Romans shaved the crown of their heads. The Celts shaved a strip from ear to ear. It was a clash of cultures, style, and authority. So, in 664 AD, Oswiu decided to settle it. He called a synod, a great meeting of the minds. He didn't hold it at York or Canterbury. He held it at a windswept abbey on the cliffs of Whitby, hosted by one of the most powerful women in English history. We are heading to the coast again. The swords are put away, and the books are opened. The Battle of the Windwade decided the physical fate of the Heptarchy, but the Synod of Whitby would decide its mind. If you stand on the headland at Whitby today, the wind tries to push you off. It's a raw, elemental place on the North Yorkshire coast, where the North Sea slams into the cliffs with the force of a freight train. High above the town, the skeletal ruins of a Gothic abbey claw at the sky. But if you strip away the later medieval stone and the Dracula tourism, you get back to the year 664 AD. Back then, this place was called Streonshall, the Bay of the Beacon, and it was the setting for the most important committee meeting in English history. The Synod of Whitby wasn't a battle of swords. It was a battle of calendars. But the stakes were just as high as any shield wall clash. This meeting would decide whether the English soul would look west to the wild, mystical Christianity of the Irish, or south to the organized imperial Christianity of Rome. The host of this high-stakes summit was a woman named Hild. We need to talk about Hild. In the Heptarchy, women often appear as pawns, peace weavers married off to seal alliances. But Hild was a queen in all but name. She was the great niece of King Edwin, the man who had the vision of the sparrow. She ran a double monastery at Whitby, meaning she was the boss of both a community of nuns and a community of monks. Think about that. In a warrior society dominated by bearded men with axes, the person they all deferred to, the person whose wisdom kings sought out, was an abbess. She was the mother of the North. The tension in her great timber hall that spring was palpable. King Oswiu was there, presiding over the chaos he had called together to fix. His wife, Queen Eanfled, was there, firmly on the Roman side, and the two teams were lining up on opposite sides of the room like it was a theological dodgeball game. On one side, you had the Celtic party. These were the men of Lindisfarne, the spiritual heirs of Aidan and Oswald. Their champion was Colman, the Bishop of Northumbria. Colman was a simple man. He wasn't a politician. He was a monk who loved the silence of the islands. He wore the Celtic tonsure, shaved from ear to ear across the front of the head, leaving long hair at the back. To the Romans, he looked like a madman. To his people, he looked like a saint. His argument was simple. We do what our fathers did. We follow the tradition of Saint Columba. It was good enough for him, so it's good enough for us. On the other side, you had the Roman party. They were slick. They were international. They wore the Petrine tonsure, the shaved crown that looks like a ring of thorns. Their champion was a young, fiery priest named Wilfrid. Wilfrid is one of those historical figures you can't help but admire, even if you wouldn't want to have dinner with him because he'd spend the whole time telling you why you're wrong. He was a Northumbrian nobleman who had travelled to Rome. He had seen the great basilicas, the mosaics, the power of the papacy. He came back to England thinking the Celtic way was backward, rustic, and embarrassing. He was the Steve Jobs of the 7th century church. He wanted standardization, sleek design, and total brand control. The debate began. It centered on the calculation of Easter. This sounds incredibly dry to us, like arguing over daylight savings time. But to them, it was a matter of cosmic order. Easter was the moment Christ conquered death. If you celebrated it on the wrong day, were you even saved? Were you mocking God? And practically speaking, as we mentioned, it was a nightmare for King Oswiu to be feasting while his wife was fasting. Coleman spoke first. He appealed to tradition. He invoked the name of Columba, the great saint of Iona. He spoke with the quiet dignity of a man who believes that holiness is found in the wind and the rain, not in books of canon law. He basically said, "Look, our ancestors were holy men. Their miracles prove they were right. Why should we change?" Then Wilfrid stood up. He didn't pull punches. He dismantled Coleman with the ruthlessness of a courtroom prosecutor. He said, essentially, "Your ancestors were pious men, sure, but they were in a corner of a remote island at the edge of the world. Do you think a handful of monks on a rock are more important than the Universal Church of Christ, which spans from Rome to Africa to Asia?" He was calling them provincials. He was calling them hicks. But Wilfrid's winning move wasn't an insult. It was a trump card. He turned to King Oswiu and asked a simple question. He quoted the Bible, Matthew 16:18, where Jesus says to Peter, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." Wilfrid looked at Coleman. Did Jesus give the keys of heaven to Columba? Coleman, being an honest man, had to answer, "No." Wilfrid turned to the king. "But do you agree he gave them to Peter?" "Yes," said the king. "Then," Wilfrid concluded, "Peter is the gatekeeper, and if you disagree with the gatekeeper, you might not get in." King Oswiu was a pragmatist. He had spent his life fighting wars, securing borders, and calculating odds. He looked at Coleman, the gentle monk who offered tradition. He looked at Wilfrid, the arrogant priest who offered the backing of the entire Roman Empire, and apparently the personal endorsement of the guy holding the keys to the pearly gates. Oswiu smiled, or so the story goes, and said, "Then I will obey the doorkeeper, lest when I come to the gates of the kingdom of heaven, there should be none to open them, he being my adversary, who is proved to have the keys." It was a joke, but it was a decision. Rome won. The Celtic cause was lost. The aftermath was heartbreaking. Coleman didn't argue. He didn't start a civil war. He simply resigned. He gathered his monks, dug up the bones of Aidan, part of them, anyway, from the church at Lindisfarne, and walked away. They went back to Iona, and then eventually to Ireland. They left the beautiful monastery on the tidal island empty of its founders. It was the end of an era. The unique, nature-loving, decentralized version of English Christianity was effectively regulated out of existence. But for England as a political entity, this was the moment it joined Europe. By siding with Rome, Oswiu connected his kingdom to the main server of Western civilization. It meant access to Roman books, Roman music, Roman building techniques, and Roman law. It meant that a monk in Jarrow could read the same texts as a monk in Naples. It paved the way for a unified English culture that superseded tribal loyalties. However, the Celtic influence didn't just vanish, it went underground. It seeped into the art. If you look at the manuscripts produced in Northumbria after Whitby, they are Roman in text but Celtic in decoration. The swirling knots, the biting animals, the intricate geometry. That's the ghost of Colman and Aidan living on in the margins of Wilfrid's Roman books. Wilfrid, naturally, took a victory lap. He became the Bishop of York and started a massive building program. He built a church at Hexham using stones robbed from Roman ruins, creating a crypt that you can still walk into today. It feels like a bunker. It feels like power. Wilfrid was the first Prince Bishop, a man who lived like a lord and fought legal battles with kings. He was the future. But the real winner, in the long run, was the silence of the library. With the church united and the political borders relatively stable under Oswio's heavy hand, Northumbria entered a period of astonishing intellectual bloom. The energy that used to go into shield walls and blood feuds began to flow into ink and parchment. The swords were beaten into plowshares, or in this case, quill pens. We are entering the Northumbrian Golden Age. It's a brief, fragile window of time where the north of England was arguably the intellectual center of Europe. And at the heart of it was a boy who was born on the lands of the monastery at Monkwearmouth Jarrow, just a few years after the Synod of Whitby. He was given to the monks at the age of 7. He never travelled further than York. He likely never fought in a battle. He spent his entire life in 2 buildings, praying, teaching, and writing. Yet, he saw more of the world than any warlord. He saw the shape of time itself. His name was Bede, and without him, we wouldn't know any of the stories we've just told. We wouldn't know about Hengist or Ethelbert or Penda. He is the lens through which we view the Heptarchy. But before we meet the father of English history, we have to appreciate the calm before the storm. The late 7th century was a time of illuminated manuscripts, stone crosses, and glass windows. It was a time when the English, having decided who they were at Whitby, started to write it down. Imagine the scriptorium at Jarrow. It's cold. The only light comes from the open shutters and tallow candles. The smell is of cured vellum and iron gall ink. A monk is hunched over a desk, his fingers stained black, copying the Gospel of John. He is creating something beautiful in a world that is still very much dangerous. This is the world Bede inherited, a world where the decision made on a windy cliff at Whitby allowed a scholar to sit in a cell and think about the history of his people. If history usually sounds like the clanging of swords and the screaming of dying men, then the late 7th and early 8th centuries in Northumbria sound like something else entirely. They sound like the scratching of a goosequill pen on sheepskin. They sound like the chanting of the Opus Dei in a stone church. They sound like the wind rattling the leaded glass windows of a library that, for a few short decades, held more knowledge than almost anywhere else in Western Europe. We have arrived at the Northumbrian Golden Age. It is the deep breath of the Heptarchy. It is the moment when the English, having just decided who they were at the Synod of Whitby, stopped fighting long enough to create things of staggering beauty. The epicenter of this explosion of culture wasn't a royal court. It was a twin monastery called Monkwearmouth Jarrow. It sat on the banks of the River Wear, and the River Tyne, in what is now the industrial heartland of Sunderland and Newcastle. Today, it's surrounded by the ghosts of shipyards and coal mines. Back then, it was the edge of the world, but it was an edge that looked outward. The man who built it was a nobleman turned monk named Benedict Biscop. He is the unsung hero of English civilization. Benedict was a shopper, a really dedicated shopper. He traveled to Rome 5 times, a journey that was dangerous, expensive, and exhausting. And every time he came back, he didn't bring weapons or gold. He brought books, he brought relics, he brought pictures. He even brought singing teachers to ensure the Northumbrian monks hit the right notes in the Gregorian chant. Most importantly, he brought masons and glaziers. Before Benedict, English windows were just holes in the wall, covered with cloth or horn. Benedict brought glass. Imagine the psychological shift of being able to see the light without feeling the wind. He built a stone world in a landscape of wood, filling his library with the intellectual wealth of the Mediterranean. And into this stone world walked a 7-year-old boy. His parents gave him to the monastery as an oblate, a child offering. He would never leave. He would never travel further than York. He would spend his entire life within the few miles between the two monastic sites. His name was Bede. Bede is a paradox. He was the most learned man of his age, yet he lived a life of extreme physical confinement. He was a Time Lord, sitting in a cold cell in Jarrow. He read Pliny and Virgil. He understood astronomy and the tides. He calculated the age of the world. He wrote roughly 60 books on everything from spelling to the apocalypse. But his masterpiece, the book that earns him the title Father of English History, is the ecclesiastical history of the English people. Completed in 731 AD, it is the reason we know about the Heptarchy. Without Bede, the centuries we've been discussing would be a dark fog of archaeology and legend. Bede didn't just write a list of kings. He crafted a narrative. He took the messy, tribal warfare of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes and wove them into a single story. The story of the gens Anglorum, the English people. He created the idea of England in his head long before it existed on a map. He looked at the chaos of the Heptarchy, the feuds, the murders, the hateful years, and he found a thread of divine purpose. To Bede, the English were a new Israel, a chosen people traveling through the wilderness of paganism toward the promised land of unified Christianity. While Bede was writing in Jarrow, his colleagues up the coast at Lindisfarne were painting. The Lindisfarne Gospels are the visual equivalent of Bede's history. If you've never looked closely at a page from this manuscript, you need to. It was created around 700 AD, likely by a single monk named Edfrith, who would later become the Bishop of Lindisfarne. Edfrith was an artist of superhuman patience. He worked on this book for perhaps 5 or 10 years. The carpet pages, those full pages of intricate, knotting design, are so complex that for centuries people thought they must have been made by angels. There are thousands of tiny interweaving lines, biting animals, and geometric shapes, all perfectly balanced. If you make one mistake in the draft, the whole page is ruined. Edfrith didn't make mistakes. The colors are still electric today. He used red lead, verdigris for green, yellow ochre, and, most luxuriously, blue made from crushed lapis lazuli. That bluestone came from the mines of Badakhshan in Afghanistan. Think about that supply chain. A rock was mined in the Himalayas, carried across the Silk Road, traded through Byzantium or Rome, brought across the Alps, shipped across the Channel, and ended up in a paint pot on a rainy island off the coast of Northumberland. The Heptarchy wasn't isolated. It was the terminus of the world's trade routes. The style of the Gospels is the perfect synthesis of the three cultures fighting for the soul of England. The swirling spirals are Celtic, a nod to the Irish founders. The beating beasts and interlaced patterns are Germanic, echoing the metalwork of Sutton Hoo. The text is Roman uncial script, clear and authoritative. It is a visual peace treaty. It says, "We are Irish, we are Saxon, we are Roman, we are Northumbrian." This period also gave us the Ruthwell Cross, a massive stone monument in Dumfriesshire, carved with scenes from the life of Christ and, remarkably, runes spelling out lines from a poem called The Dream of the Rood. This is one of the earliest English poems, where the cross itself speaks, describing how it felt to be the tree cut down to hold the Savior. It's a haunting, visceral piece of literature, bridging the gap between the warrior culture, where the cross is a loyal retainer to its Lord, and the new faith. Life in this golden age wasn't easy, of course. The monks still froze in the winter. Plague was a constant visitor. Bede himself survived a plague that killed every other monk in the choir, except for him and his abbot, leaving the two of them to sing the daily offices alone, their voices echoing in the empty church. But compared to the bloodbaths of Penda and the instability of the migration era, this was a halcyon summer. It was a time when a king like Aldfrith of Northumbria, Oswu's son, was not just a warrior, but a scholar who could exchange letters with abbots. It was a time when the export of England wasn't mercenaries, but missionaries. English monks, ironically, started going back to the continent to convert the pagan Germans in the Old Country. Men like St. Boniface left the peace of the English monasteries to face martyrdom in the forests of Frisia and Saxony. Bede died in 735 AD. There is a moving account of his death written by one of his students, Cuthbert. The old master was struggling to breathe, his feet swelling, but he kept dictating his translation of the Gospel of John into Old English. He wanted to finish it before the end. On his last evening, the boy writing for him said, "Dear master, there is still one sentence that is not written down." Bede said, "Write it quickly." A few moments later, the boy said, "It is finished." Bede replied, "You have spoken the truth. It is finished." He sat on the floor of his cell, sang the Gloria, and died. With Bede's death, the sun began to set on the Northumbrian Golden Age. The kingdom began to destabilize. Kings were assassinated, tonsured forcibly, or abdicated. The discipline of the monasteries slipped. Bede himself had written a letter near the end of his life, complaining that some monasteries had become nothing more than tax shelters for lazy nobles who wanted to drink wine and wear fancy clothes. The intellectual light didn't go out, but it dimmed. The center of gravity in the Heptarchy was shifting again. While Northumbria was praying and painting, the Midlands were waking up. The vacuum left by Penda's death in 655 had been slowly filling. The kingdom of Mercia, that vast, sprawling territory in the middle of the map, was not done. It had recovered from the disaster at the Wynwade. A new generation of kings was rising. Ruthless, ambitious men who looked at the wealth of the church and saw a resource to be exploited, not just revered. "We are leaving the library now. We are blowing out the candle in Bede's cell and stepping back out into the mud. The southern Heptarchy is about to endure the rise of a king who would call himself not just a king of Mercia, but the king of the southern English. His name was Ethelbald, and his story marks the beginning of the Mercian supremacy, a century where the Midlands would grip the island by the throat. The Golden Age is over. The Age of Iron is back. With the death of Bede in 735 AD, the spotlight of history swings south. We are leaving the wind-battered cliffs of Northumbria and heading down into the dripping, misty heart of the Midlands. We are going back to the fens, that vast, watery landscape of reeds and islands where the earth itself feels unstable. It was here, hiding in the swamps, that the next great architect of England was forged. His name was Ethelbald. And if Penda was the hammer of Mercia, Ethelbald was the anvil. Ethelbald didn't start as a king. He started as a nuisance. In the early 8th century, the reigning king of Mercia, a man named Ceolred, was paranoid. He saw young Ethelbald, a distant cousin with a suspiciously strong claim to the throne, as a threat. So, Ceolred did what paranoid kings do. He drove Ethelbald into exile. Ethelbald fled to the wildest place he could find, the Crowland Fens. Today, this is drained farmland, but back then, it was a malaria-ridden labyrinth of black water and fog. It was a place for outlaws and demons, but it was also a place for hermits. Living on a tiny island in the middle of this swamp was a man named Guthlac. Guthlac is a fascinating figure, a former warrior who gave up violence to battle spiritual demons in the wilderness. He lived in a barrow, an ancient burial mound, wore animal skins, and was rumored to speak the language of birds. When the fugitive Ethelbald showed up, exhausted and terrified, Guthlac took him in. It's a scene straight out of a myth. The future king sitting at the feet of the wild mystic, listening to the wind howl over the marshes. Guthlac didn't just offer shelter. He offered a prophecy. He told Ethelbald not to despair. He promised him that he would not only survive, but would become the king of the Mercians, and that he wouldn't need to kill for it. God would hand it to him. In 716 AD, the prophecy came true. King Ceolred died. It wasn't a glorious death. He reportedly went mad at a feast, shouting at demons only he could see, before collapsing. The throne was empty. Ethelbald emerged from the swamps, the mud of exile still on his boots, and walked into the royal hall at Tamworth to claim his crown. He would wear it for 41 years. In the volatile world of the Heptarchy, a 41-year reign is almost suspicious. It implies a grip on power so tight it strangled all opposition. Ethelbald is often overshadowed by his successor, Offa, but Ethelbald was the one who built the machine. He created the Mercian supremacy. Under Ethelbald, Mercia stopped being just the Middle Kingdom and became the heavyweight champion of the South. He pushed his borders in every direction. He rattled the Welsh kings. He dominated the smaller kingdoms of Essex and East Anglia. But his biggest prize was the control of London. London in the 8th century, Lundenwic, wasn't the Roman city inside the walls. It was a bustling trading strand along the beach, near modern Covent Garden. It was where the money was. By controlling London, Ethelbald controlled the flow of wine, pottery, and luxury goods into the island. He wasn't just a warlord. He was the toll collector of England. He began to use a title that makes historians raise their eyebrows. Rex Britannia, King of Britain, not King of Mercia. He was claiming the whole island. But Ethelbald wasn't a saint, far from it. We know this because we have his mail. Specifically, we have a letter written to him by Saint Boniface. Boniface was an English missionary working in Germany, a man of immense prestige. In 746 AD, he sat down to write a performance review for King Ethelbald. It starts politely enough, praising Ethelbald's charity to the poor and his ability to keep the peace. But then, Boniface takes the gloves off. He accuses the king of two major crimes. First, stealing church revenues to pay his soldiers. Ethelbald had realized that monasteries were sitting on a lot of tax-free land, and he started squeezing them for cash. He was arguably the first English king to treat the church as a piggy bank. Second, and more salaciously, Boniface accuses Ethelbald of being a nun chaser. He writes that the king has refused to take a lawful wife and instead satisfies his lust in lascivious debauchery, with the nuns and virgins consecrated to God. Imagine receiving that letter. It wasn't private. These letters were circulated. The most famous holy man in Europe was calling the most powerful king in Britain a sacrilegious predator. It tells us that Ethelbald was a man of immense appetite and arrogance. He felt he was above the laws of the church. He was the king, and in his mind, everything in his kingdom, the land, the gold, the women, belonged to him. And yet, despite the scandals, he was effective. The southern kingdoms, particularly Wessex, were kept in a state of terrified obedience. The king of Wessex, Guthred, spent years as Ethelbald's reluctant wingman, forced to march in Mercian armies against the Welsh. Ethelbald was the Bretzwalder in all but name, holding the leash of the Heptarchy. But absolute power breeds absolute resentment. By the 750s, the cracks were showing. The king of Wessex, tired of being a puppet, rebelled. They fought a battle at Burford in 752 AD. The legends say the West Saxon standard-bearer managed to put the Mercians to flight. It was a check on Ethelbald's power, a sign that the old lion was losing his teeth. But the end, when it came, didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in the dark. The year is 757 AD. The location is Seckington, a royal manor near the Mercian capital of Tamworth. Ethelbald is sleeping. He is secure in the heart of his kingdom, surrounded by his Hathweru, his household troops. These are the men sworn to die for him. They eat his bread, they wear his gold rings, and they have sworn holy oaths to protect his body. In the dead of night, they enter his chamber, and they murder him. We don't know the details. Was it a quick knife across the throat? A suffocating pillow? A chaotic struggle? The chronicle is stark. He was killed at night by his own bodyguards. This is shocking. In Anglo-Saxon culture, killing your lord was the ultimate sin. It was worse than murder. It was a cosmic betrayal. For an entire bodyguard unit to turn on a king who had ruled for 40 years suggests a conspiracy of massive proportions. Was he a tyrant who had pushed them too far? Had a rival paid them off? Or was it just the brutal pragmatism of men who saw a failing leader and wanted to back a new horse? Ethelbald's death shattered the peace he had enforced. The kingdom of Mercia, so long the stabilizer of the island, instantly convulsed into civil war. A man named Bjornred briefly seized the throne. He is a ghost in the record, a king for a day, who likely led the conspiracy. But he didn't last. The sheer horror of the regicide likely turned the stomach of the Mercian nobility. They looked for a legitimate heir, someone from the royal line who could restore order. They looked to another cousin, Out of the chaos of 757 AD rode a man who would make Ethelbald look like a warm-up act. He came from the same ruthless stock, but he had a vision that went beyond mere dominance. He wanted equality with the emperors of Europe. He wanted to redraw the map, literally and figuratively. Ethelbald had built the foundation, digging it deep into the mud of the fens and cementing it with 40 years of iron rule. But the man coming next would build the cathedral. He would mint the coins, dig the dikes, and treat with Charlemagne as a brother. The Mercian supremacy was about to enter its imperial phase. The usurper Bjornred was swept aside, fleeing into the history book's footnotes. The new king took the throne. His name was Offa, and he is, without a doubt, the greatest English king you've probably never heard enough about. If Ethelbald was the warm-up act, Offa was the main event. He is the colossus of the Anglo-Saxon age, a figure so large he almost breaks the scale of the Heptarchy. Yet, strangely, he is often the forgotten king in popular culture, overshadowed by Alfred the Great a century later. Alfred saved England, yes, but Offa was the first man to really act like he owned the place. He seized the throne in 757 AD, straight out of the bloody civil war that followed Ethelbald's murder. He didn't waste time. He swept aside the usurper Bjornred and ruthlessly consolidated his power. Within a few years, he wasn't just the king of Mercia. He was the king of the southern English. Kent, Sussex, East Anglia, Wessex, they all fell in line. Some he conquered, some he bullied, and some he simply beheaded the leaders of until the rest got the message. But Offa wasn't just a brute. He was a visionary bureaucrat. He understood that true power isn't just about how many men you can kill. It's about how many coins you can mint. Before Offa, money in England was a chaotic mess of gold, trimsas, and inconsistent silver scatters. It was like trying to pay for your groceries with a handful of random foreign change. Offa changed that. He introduced a new coin, the silver penny. This wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a revolution. It was high quality, consistent in weight, and stamped with the king's name and portrait. It looked Roman. It felt authoritative. When you held an Offa penny, you felt the weight of the state in your palm. This little silver disc became the standard currency of England for the next 700 years. If you've ever wondered why the British symbol for a penny was D from the Roman denarius, it's because Offa was consciously copying the imperial model. He even minted a gold coin, a mancus, that copied an Islamic dinar so perfectly it still had the Arabic text on it, with Offa Rex stamped upside down in the middle. He clearly couldn't read Arabic. He just knew it was the currency of international trade, and he wanted in on the action. That's the key to Offa. He didn't see himself as a local tribal leader. He saw himself as a European player. And there was only one other man in Europe who mattered at that time: Charlemagne. The relationship between Offa and Charlemagne is one of the great frenemies stories of history. Charlemagne was the king of the Franks, the master of the continent, the man who would become the first Holy Roman Emperor. He was used to people bowing to him. Offa didn't bow. They exchanged letters. We still have some of them. Charlemagne writes to his dearest brother Offa. It sounds friendly, but there is an underlying tension. It's two alpha predators circling each other across the English Channel. They discuss trade, specifically the quality of English wool cloaks. Charlemagne complains they are too short. and black stones, probably coal or millstones, from France. It's the first recorded commercial treaty in English history. But then, things got awkward. Offa suggested a marriage alliance. He proposed that his son, Ecgfrith, should marry Charlemagne's daughter, Bertha. Charlemagne was insulted. He considered his family to be of a higher tier. He refused. So Offa, with the confidence of a man who owns the island, shot back. Fine. Then how about your son Charles marries my daughter Elflaed? Charlemagne went ballistic. He was so angry at the audacity of this Mercian upstart that he closed all the Frankish ports to English traders. He initiated a trade embargo. Offa, not blinking for a second, closed all the English ports to Frankish traders. It was a full-blown trade war in the 8th century. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed, mostly because they were both losing money, and the ports reopened. But the message was clear. Offa demanded to be treated as an equal. He even started using the title Rex Anglorum, King of the English, not King of Mercia. He was test-driving the concept of a unified nation. But while his coins and his letters show his ambition, his greatest legacy is written in the mud. If you go to the Welsh border today, you can still walk along it. It's a scar on the landscape that refuses to heal. Offa's Dyke. It is a massive earthwork barrier running roughly from the River Dee in the north to the River Wye in the south. It's about 176 miles long, though the earthwork itself covers about 80 miles of that, plugging the gaps between natural barriers. It consists of a deep ditch on the Welsh side and a high bank on the English side, often rising up to 25 feet. The sheer scale of this thing is mind-boggling. It's the largest construction project in Britain since the Romans built Hadrian's Wall. It would have required thousands of men moving millions of tons of earth, likely over several summers. It wasn't just a fence. It was a statement. Historians argue about its purpose. Was it a defensive wall to stop Welsh raiding parties? Probably not. It's too long to man effectively. If the Welsh wanted to jump over it and steal a cow, they could. Was it a customs barrier to tax trade? Maybe. But the most likely answer is that it was a boundary marker. It was Offa drawing a line in the dirt and saying to the Welsh kings, "This is where your world ends and mine begins. Do not cross." It forced the Welsh to look west, defining their identity in opposition to the English. And it defined England as everything east of the Dyke. In a way, Offa invented Wales just as much as he invented England. The construction of the Dyke also tells us about Offa's power over his own people. You can't build something like that unless you can command labor from every corner of your kingdom. You need peasants from the Midlands, food supplies from the south, timber, tools, and surveyors. It proves that the merchant state was a sophisticated machine capable of logistical miracles. Offa also had a ruthless side when it came to his fellow kings. In 794 AD, the king of East Anglia, a young man named Ethelbert, yes, another one, came to Offa's court to ask for the hand of Offa's daughter in marriage. It seemed like a standard diplomatic visit. But something went wrong. According to the legends, Offa's wife, Queen Cynethryth, who often gets painted as the Lady Macbeth of the story, whispered in Offa's ear that Ethelbert was a threat. So, Offa had him beheaded. Just like that. A guest, a suitor, a fellow king. Ethelbert was immediately canonized as a saint, and the cathedral in Hereford is dedicated to him. It was a shocking breach of hospitality that stained Offa's reputation forever. It showed a paranoia creeping in at the end of his reign. He was so desperate to secure the succession for his son Ecgfrith that he had him anointed king while Offa was still alive, the first recorded coronation of an English king. He eliminated every possible rival claimant. He purged the family tree. Offa died in 796 AD. He had ruled for 39 years. He had built a wall, changed the currency, and stared down Charlemagne. He seemed to have built a dynasty that would last 1,000 years. But here is the tragedy of the Heptarchy. It all hangs on the strength of one man, his son, Ecgfrith. The boy for whom Offa had killed so many rivals succeeded him, and he ruled for 141 days. He died suddenly, likely from natural causes, though some whispered it was divine punishment for his father's bloodthirstiness. With Ecgfrith dead and the other potential heirs already wiped out by Offa's purges, the Mercian dynasty collapsed. The supremacy didn't end overnight, but the iron grip was broken. Distant cousins fought for the scraps. The kingdom of Wessex, long suppressed under Offa's boot, began to stir in the south. And while the English kings were squabbling over the vacuum left by Offa, looking inward at their own petty borders, they missed the shadow falling over the sea. In the final years of Offa's reign, there had been a strange omen. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports immense whirlwinds and flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. It sounds like folklore. It sounds like the kind of thing terrified monks write when they want to explain why God is angry. But the dragons were real. They just weren't flying. They were sailing. The ships were made of oak, shallow drafted, and fast. They had square sails and prows carved into the shapes of beasts. They were coming from the fjords of Norway and the sounds of Denmark. The men on board didn't care about Offa's dike. They didn't care about the silver penny. And they certainly didn't care about the Pope. The isolation of the island was about to be shattered in a way that made the Roman exit look like a gentle misunderstanding. The Heptarchy had spent 400 years fighting itself, slowly coalescing into larger kingdoms. But now, a new player was entering the game who wanted to flip the board over entirely. We are heading back to the north, back to the holy island of Lindisfarne. The monks are chanting, the gulls are crying, and on the horizon, the sails are snapping in the wind. The Viking Age is about to begin. If you could pick one day to stand on the shore of Holy Island and watch the history of the world change, it would be the 8th of June, 793 AD. It was likely a calm summer day. The North Sea, usually a churning grey monster, can be deceptively placid in June. The monks of Lindisfarne were going about their business, chanting the offices, tending their gardens, copying manuscripts in the scriptorium. They felt safe. Why wouldn't they? They were living on the holiest ground in England, protected by the spiritual shield of Saint Cuthbert, whose bones rested in the reliquary. For nearly 160 years, this island had been a sanctuary. Kings might kill each other on the mainland, but you didn't touch the monks. That was the rule. Then the horizon changed. Ships appeared, but not the clunky trading vessels they were used to. These ships were sleek, low in the water, and moved with a terrifying predatory speed. They didn't rely on the wind. They had oars, snapping in perfect unison, driving the hulls through the surf. As they got closer, the monks might have seen the prows carved into the shapes of dragons or serpents. They might have seen the glint of sun on iron helmets. The ships crunched onto the white sand. Men bored over the gunwales. They were big, They were shouting in a language that sounded like grinding stones, and they were carrying axes. The sack of Lindisfarne wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. The monks had no weapons. They ran into the church, clinging to the altar, believing that the sanctity of the space would protect them. It didn't. The raiders kicked down the doors. They cut down the priests where they stood. They stripped the gold and jewels from the reliquaries. They tore the silver covers off the gospel books and threw the parchment pages, the work of decades, onto the floor to be trampled in the blood. Alcuin of York, the great Northumbrian scholar who was living at the court of Charlemagne, received the news with absolute horror. He wrote a letter that echoes down the centuries. Lo, it is nearly 350 years that we and our fathers have inhabited this most lovely land, and never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold, the church of Saint Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as a prey to pagan peoples. Never before has such terror appeared. That is the key phrase. It wasn't just the violence. Violence was common in the Heptarchy. It was the nature of the violence. It was the violation of the taboo. These attackers didn't care about the Christian God. To them, a monastery wasn't a holy site. It was just a soft target full of gold and unarmed men. It was a bank with the doors unlocked. These men were Vikings. Specifically, they were likely Norwegians from Hordaland. They were the shock troops of a cultural explosion that was pushing the Scandinavian peoples outward in search of land, wealth, and fame. The attack on Lindisfarne shattered the psychological security of the English kingdoms. The sea, which had been a highway for trade and missionaries, had suddenly become a threat vector. The moat of the English Channel and the North Sea was no longer a defense. It was an open door for wolves, and the theological crisis was even deeper. The English had been taught by Bede that they were God's chosen people, the new Israel. If God was allowing pagans to slaughter his priests on his holiest altar, what did that mean? Had they sinned? Was this a punishment? Alcuin certainly thought so. He blamed the attack on the moral failings of the English. Specifically, he complained about the way the monks were dressing, too fancy, their drinking habits, and even the way the nobles were trimming their beards like pagans. It's a very human reaction. When disaster strikes, we look for a reason, something we did wrong, so that we can fix it and be safe again. But the Vikings didn't care about beards. They cared about silver. The following year, 794 AD, they returned. This time, they hit Jarrow, Bede's own monastery. But this time, the English were ready. The local militia met them on the beach. A storm caught the Viking fleet, smashing several ships against the rocks. The raiders who washed ashore were killed by the locals. It was a small victory, a moment of, we can fight back. But it was a false dawn. The raids stopped for a while, or at least the major recorded ones did. Likely because the Vikings found easier pickings in Ireland and Scotland. Iona was burned. The monks there were slaughtered in the Bay of Martyrs. The famous Book of Kells was likely hurried away to safety during these attacks. For the kings of the Heptarchy, this should have been the moment to unite. The wolf was at the door. It was time to stop squabbling over border dikes and join forces. But they didn't. The early 9th century, The period immediately following Lindisfarne is a mess of internal politics. The Mercian supremacy was slowly dying. After Offa's son died in 141 days, a distant relative named Coenwulf took the throne. He was a strong king, brutal and effective. He actually invaded Kent and captured the Archbishop of Canterbury, dragging him back to Mercia as a prisoner. But he was fighting yesterday's war. He was still trying to dominate the other English kingdoms, ignoring the storm clouds gathering in the north. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Wessex was waking up. We haven't talked about Wessex in a while. Since Cerdic landed in the mud, the West Saxons had been the scrappy underdogs, often bullied by Mercia. But in 802 AD, a man named Ecbert became king of Wessex. Ecbert had spent years in exile at the court of Charlemagne. He had seen how a real empire worked. He had learned from the master. When he returned to Wessex, he played the long game. He built up his strength while Mercia slowly exhausted itself fighting the Welsh and the East Anglians. In 825 AD, the inevitable happened. Ecbert met the Mercian king Beornwulf at the Battle of Ellendun. Ellendun is one of the decisive battles of English history. It was a bloodbath. When the sun set, the Mercian supremacy was dead in the ditch. The power shifted south permanently. Wessex was now the top dog. Ecbert was hailed as the Bretwalda. But while Ecbert was celebrating his victory, the nature of the Viking threat was changing. For the first few decades, the Vikings were raiders. They were hit and run. They would land, grab the gold, grab the slaves, and vanish before the local fyrd, militia, could mobilize. It was terrifying, but it was sporadic. You could live your whole life and never see a Viking. But by the 830s and 840s, the fleets were getting bigger. They weren't just 3 ships anymore. They were 30, 50, 100. And they weren't just hitting coastal monasteries. They were sailing up the rivers, the Thames, the Severn, the Humber, striking deep into the heart of the country. They started overwintering. This was the crucial shift. Instead of going home to Norway or Denmark for the winter, they would build a fortified camp on an island in a river, like Sheppey or Thanet, and stay. This meant they were there year-round. It meant they were getting comfortable. In 850 AD, a fleet of 350 ships arrived. This number might be exaggerated, but it represents a force of thousands. They stormed Canterbury. They stormed London. The king of Mercia, Beornwulf, tried to fight them and was crushed. It seemed like nothing could stop them. But then the West Saxons stepped up. Ecgbert's son, Ethelwulf, was now king of Wessex. Ethelwulf gets a bad rap in history as being overly pious and weak, largely because his son was Alfred the Great. And it's hard to look good standing next to a legend. But Ethelwulf was a tough, competent warrior. In 851 AD, at a place called Aclea, Field of Oaks, Ethelwulf and his son Ethelbald, yes, they reused names a lot, met this massive Viking army. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it with grim satisfaction. They made the greatest slaughter of a heathen army that we have heard tell of up to this present day, and there took the victory. It was a huge win. It proved that the Vikings were not invincible demons. They bled just like anyone else. The victory at Aclea bought England a little time. It seemed like the crisis might be manageable. The Vikings were dangerous, yes, but they could be beaten in a pitched battle. The kings of the Heptarchy, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, went back to their usual bickering, thinking they had weathered the storm. They were wrong. What they had faced so far were disjointed raiding parties, private enterprise warlords looking for cash. They had not yet faced a national migration. They had not faced a unified political conquest. In 865 AD, a new kind of army landed in East Anglia. It wasn't looking for quick loot. It wasn't planning to go home. It was led by three brothers who have become legends: Ivar the Boneless, Uber, and Halfdan. They were the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, a semi-mythical figure who was said to have been killed by the king of Northumbria in a pit of snakes. Whether the snake pit story is true or not, the motivation was clear. They weren't here to raid. They were here for revenge, and they were here to stay. The Chronicle calls this force the Mysal Heathen here, the great heathen army. The monks watched from their towers. The kings looked at their depleted treasuries. The peasants looked at their fields. The raids were over. The war for the existence of England had begun. The dragon ships weren't just visiting anymore. They were unloading the furniture. The year 865 AD marks the moment the English nightmare went from bad to terminal. Before this, the Vikings were like a storm, violent, destructive, but ultimately passing. You could hide in the woods, wait for the ships to leave, and then rebuild your burned roof. But the force that landed in East Anglia that autumn wasn't a storm. It was a glacier. It was slow, massive, and it ground everything in its path to dust. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which usually spares words like a miser spares pennies, calls it the Mysal Heathen here, the great heathen army. It's a chilling distinction. In Old English, the word here was used specifically for enemy forces, for raiding armies. The English forces were called the Fyrd, the defenders. This army was different in size, estimated by modern historians to be anywhere from a few thousand to perhaps 5 or 10,000 warriors. In an age where a large army might be a few hundred men, this was a moving city of violence. But it wasn't just the numbers. It was the leadership. The legends say they were led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. We have Ivar the Boneless, a man whose nickname has puzzled historians for centuries. Was he double-jointed? Did he have a degenerative bone disease like osteogenesis imperfecta? Or was it a metaphor for his flexibility in battle, or perhaps impotence? Whatever the medical reality, Ivar was a terrifying tactical genius, the brains of the operation. Then there was Uber, the berserker, and Halfdan, the king. They were united by a singular purpose that went beyond gold. They wanted land, and according to the sagas, they wanted blood vengeance for their father. They landed in East Anglia. The king of East Anglia, Edmund, took one look at this force and made a calculation. He couldn't beat them, so he bought them off. He provided them with winter quarters, and crucially, he gave them horses. This is the turning point. The Vikings were no longer just sea wolves. They were now a mounted infantry. They used the horses to move rapidly across the country, dismounting to fight on foot in the traditional shield wall formation. They had become a mobile strike force that could outmaneuver any clumsy English fyrd. In the autumn of 866, the great heathen army rode north. They weren't heading for a random monastery. They were heading for York. Northumbria, once the beacon of learning and the home of Bede, was now a basket case. The kingdom was tearing itself apart in a civil war between two rival kings. Osbert, the legitimate ruler who had been deposed, and Aella, a usurper who had seized the throne. The Vikings couldn't have planned it better. While the Northumbrians were busy fighting each other, the heathens simply walked into York. They took the city on November 1st, All Saints' Day. The leaders of York were all in the cathedral praying. It was a tactical masterstroke by Ivar. The Romans had built York's walls to keep barbarians out, but the walls had crumbled, and the current occupants were too distracted to man them properly. The Vikings occupied the city, refortified the Roman defenses, and settled in for the winter. Suddenly, the Northumbrians realized that their petty civil war was irrelevant. Osbert and Isla, who likely wanted to kill each other, were forced to shake hands. They united their armies and marched on York in March 867 to take their city back. It was a disaster. The chronicle tells us the Northumbrians breached the walls and got into the city, but fighting Vikings in the narrow, winding streets of a city they now controlled was a death trap. The English were bottled up and slaughtered. Both King Osbert and King Isla were killed. The flower of the Northumbrian nobility was wiped out in a single afternoon. This is where the history gets dark and legendary. According to the Norse sagas, Ivar didn't just kill Isla in battle. He captured him. Isla was the man who had supposedly thrown Ragnar Lothbrok into the snake pit. So, Ivar subjected him to the Blood Eagle. It's a ritual execution so gruesome, involving cutting the ribs from the spine and pulling the lungs to look like wings, that historians still debate if it was real or just a terrifying literary invention of later poets. Real or not, the message was clear. The House of Northumbria is dead. With the kings gone, Northumbria ceased to be an independent English kingdom. The Vikings installed a puppet king, a man named Ecgbert, a common name, confusingly, to collect taxes for them. And then they looked south. One kingdom down, 3 to go. The army didn't stop. In 867, they moved south into Mercia, taking up winter quarters at Nottingham. The king of Mercia, Burgred, panicked. He did the only thing he could think of. He called his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law happened to be King Ethelred of Wessex. This is the first time we see Wessex and Mercia, the two old rivals, genuinely teaming up to save the island. King Ethelred and his younger brother, a prince named Alfred, remember that name, marched north with the West Saxon army. They besieged the Vikings in Nottingham. But here's the thing about Vikings in a fortress. They are incredibly hard to dig out. The great heathen army simply sat behind the walls and refused to come out and fight. The English besieged them for weeks, but they couldn't breach the defenses. Eventually, a truce was called. The Mercians paid the Vikings a massive sum of money, the Danegeld, to go away. The Vikings took the gold and went back to York. It looked like a victory for Mercia, but it was really just a stay of execution. The Vikings were patient. They spent a year in York, consolidating their power, resting, and likely recruiting more men from overseas. Then, in 869, they moved again. This time, they bypassed Mercia and headed back to East Anglia, the place where they had first landed. They set up camp at Thetford. King Edmund of East Anglia decided he had had enough. He had bought them off once with horses. He wasn't going to buy them off again. He raised his army and met them in battle. It was a massacre. The East Anglian army was destroyed. Edmund was captured. The death of King Edmund is one of the foundational stories of medieval England. The Vikings demanded he renounce his faith and become their vassal. Edmund refused, so they tied him to a tree and used him for target practice. Archers shot him full of arrows until he looked like a hedgehog, according to the traditional account. Then they beheaded him and threw his head into the brambles. Legend says that when his followers came looking for the head, they heard a voice calling, "Here, here." They found a wolf guarding the head, refusing to let other animals eat it. Edmund became Saint Edmund the Martyr. For centuries, he was the patron saint of England, before St. George took over. His shrine at Bury St. Edmunds became a massive pilgrimage site. But saints don't stop armies. With Edmund dead, East Anglia fell. The Vikings now controlled the entire eastern seaboard of England, from the Tyne in the north to the Thames in the south. 2 kingdoms down, 2 to go. The great heathen army was now the master of the board. They had decapitated Northumbria and East Anglia. They had humiliated Mercia. The only power left standing that posed any real threat was Wessex. In 870, the Vikings turned their eyes toward the chalk hills of the southwest. They moved their base to Reading, a strategic spot right on the border of Wessex, between the Thames and the Kennet rivers. They built a rampart between the rivers, creating an instant fortress. This was it. The invasion of Wessex had begun. The West Saxons, led by King Ethelred and Prince Alfred, rode out to meet them. What followed was the year of battles. In 871 alone, 9 major battles were fought between the West Saxons and the Vikings. It was a meat grinder. The first clash at Englefield was a Saxon victory. The second at Reading was a Viking victory. Then came the Battle of Ashdown. Ashdown is important because it's the moment Alfred steps out of the shadows. The story goes that on the morning of the battle, King Ethelred was stuck in his tent, praying at Mass. He refused to come out until the service was finished. The Vikings were deploying on the ridge, getting the high ground. Alfred, seeing the danger, couldn't wait for his brother. He ordered the charge. Bede describes Alfred charging like a wild boar. The Saxons slammed into the Viking shield wall around a lone, gnarled thorn tree. It was a chaotic, bloody struggle on the snowy downs, but the Saxons won. They drove the Vikings back to Reading, killing one of their kings, Bagseg, and 5 jarls. It felt like a turning point, but the great heathen army was like a hydra. You cut off a head, and 2 more appeared. 2 weeks later, the Vikings won a battle at Basing. 2 months later, they won at Mertun. Then tragedy struck Wessex. King Ethelred died. He wasn't killed in battle, but likely died from wounds or the sheer exhaustion of the campaign. He left behind 2 young sons, but in the middle of an existential war, you don't put a child on the throne. The Witan, the Council of Wise Men, chose the only adult male left in the royal line. They chose the bookish, sickly, 21-year-old prince who had charged like a boar at Ashdown. In April 871, Alfred became King of Wessex. He didn't have a coronation party. He had a funeral for his brother, and then he immediately had to ride out to fight another battle at Wilton. He lost. Alfred's reign began in defeat. The West Saxons were broken. Their manpower was exhausted. Alfred, looking at his shattered army and the endless waves of Vikings, did the only thing he could do. He opened the treasury. He paid the Danegeld. He bought peace. The Vikings, weighed down with West Saxon gold, agreed to leave Wessex. They moved to London to spend the winter. Alfred had bought himself time, but he knew, and Ivar, who had now left for Ireland, knew, and the new leader Guthrum knew, that this wasn't over. It was just half-time. The Vikings turned their attention back to Mercia. Poor, battered Mercia. In 874, They drove King Burgred into exile. He fled to Rome and died there, a broken man. The Vikings didn't even bother to install a strong puppet. They put a man named Ceolwulf on the throne, whom the chronicle calls a foolish king's thing. They split Mercia in half. The Vikings took the east, the 5 boroughs of Danelaw, and Ceolwulf got the west. 3 kingdoms down. Northumbria was gone. East Anglia was gone. Mercia was partitioned and broken. Only Wessex remained. Alfred sat in his hall at Winchester, listening to the reports. The circle was closing. He used the peace he had bought to try and rebuild. But in 878, the truce expired in the most treacherous way possible. It was Twelfth Night. Christmas festivities were winding down. Alfred was at his royal estate in Chippenham, likely enjoying the midwinter feast. He thought he was safe. It was winter. Armies didn't march in winter. But Guthrum, the Viking warlord, didn't play by the rules. He force-marched his army through the snow. He struck Chippenham in a surprise night attack. The West Saxon defenses collapsed. The royal bodyguard was scattered. Alfred, the last king of the English, barely escaped with his life. He fled into the night, not with an army, but with a handful of retainers. He disappeared into the swamps of the Somerset levels. Wessex had fallen. The conquest of England was, for all intents and purposes, complete. We need to hit the pause button on the timeline. I know we just left Alfred running for his life in the snow of 878, and we will get back to him in the swamps in a moment. But to really understand why Alfred's survival mattered so much, we have to look back at what happened in East Anglia a few years prior. We skimmed over the death of King Edmund, but the full story of the dismantling of East Anglia is the perfect case study for the death of the Heptarchy itself. It wasn't just a political conquest, it was a cultural lobotomy. When the great heathen army rolled into East Anglia in 869, they weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting a civilization. East Anglia and the bordering fens were the engine room of English monasticism. This was the land of the great abbeys, Ely, Crowland, Tournai, and Medeshamstede, which we now call Peterborough. These weren't just churches. They were the archives, the banks, the libraries, and the hospitals of the era. The destruction of these places in 870 is one of the great tragedies of English history. It's our own miniature version of the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Take the Abbey of Crowland, for instance. It was built on the site of St. Guthlac's hermitage, the guy who spoke to birds and advised King Ethelbald. The Viking army arrived at the gates just as the monks were celebrating Mass. The abbot, a man named Theodore, ordered the younger and stronger monks to flee into the marshes with the holy relics and the jewels. He, along with the elderly and the children, stayed behind. He thought, perhaps naively, that the Vikings would respect their age and unarmed status. He was wrong. The Danes burst into the church. Abbot Theodore was cut down at the high altar. The other monks were hunted through the cloisters and tortured to reveal where the treasure was hidden. When they didn't talk, because the guys who knew where the gold was had already run away, the Vikings smashed everything. They piled the pews, the books, and the bodies into a heap and set the place on fire. The fire at Crowland was said to be visible for miles across the flat fenland horizon. Then they moved to Medeshamstede, Peterborough. This was an even bigger prize. It housed a library full of Roman and Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. The Vikings breached the walls and slaughtered everyone. 84 monks, including the abbot. The library was torched. Just stop and think about that for a second. We don't know what was in those books. Histories of the early kings, poems like Beowulf that we've never heard of, medical treatises, maps. All of it turned to ash in a single afternoon because parchment burns terrifyingly well. The memory of the Heptarchy was being erased. This context makes the fate of King Edmund even more poignant. When we talked about him being shot full of arrows like a hedgehog, it sounds like a legend. But the reality was likely a calculated piece of political theater. Eva and Uba didn't kill Edmund just because he was an enemy combatant. They killed him to break the line of succession. In the other kingdoms, the Vikings often installed a puppet king, a collaborator who would collect taxes for them. They did it in Northumbria. They did it in Mercia. But in East Anglia, they didn't want a puppet. They wanted the land. By executing Edmund in a ritualistic way, whether it was the blood eagle or the archery practice, they were sending a message. Your God cannot save you. Your lineage ends here. They systematically hunted down the East Anglian nobility. If you were a thegn in Norfolk or Suffolk, you had two choices: die or become a farmer under Danish rule. The result was the creation of the Danelaw. This wasn't just a zone of occupation. It was a new country. The legal system changed. The language changed. Old English started absorbing Norse words that we still use today. Words like sky, egg, window, law, take, they, them. Even the place names changed. Look at a map of East Anglia and the East Midlands today. Anywhere ending in by, Derby, Whitby, Grimsby, or Thorpe, Scunthorpe, Mablethorpe, is a Viking settlement. These were the new landlords. The martyrdom of East Anglia wasn't just about one king dying. It was about the complete liquidation of the native ruling class and the church structure. The bishoprics of Dunwich and Elmham effectively vanished for decades. The diocese was wiped off the map. This is why the stakes for Alfred were so high. As he fled Chippenham in 878, he knew exactly what was coming for Wessex. He wasn't just worried about losing his crown. He was worried about Wessex becoming another East Anglia. He was looking at the total extinction of West Saxon culture. If Guthrum caught him, there would be no puppet king. Alfred would be tied to a tree and shot. The library at Winchester would burn just like Peterborough. The lineage of Cerdic would be snapped, and the entire island would become a Scandinavian outpost. The concept of England would die in the cradle. The Heptarchy, the Seven Kingdoms, was effectively gone. Northumbria was a Danish colony. East Anglia was a Danish kingdom. Mercia was a broken vassal state. Sussex, Essex, and Kent were swallowed up. There was only one domino left standing, and that domino was currently hiding in a swamp, wet, cold, and presumably very, very angry. The ancient structure had been dismantled. The board had been cleared. The future of the English language, the Christian faith in Britain, and the monarchy now rested entirely on the shoulders of a sick young man in the Somerset levels. It's the ultimate underdog story. But before the comeback, you have to hit rock bottom. And for Alfred, rock bottom looked a lot like a muddy island called Athelney. If you visit the county of Somerset today, it's a lovely patchwork of green fields, cider orchards, and quaint villages. But if you strip away the drainage ditches and the modern roads, you are left with a landscape that is mostly water. In the 9th century, The Somerset Levels were a vast inland sea of reed beds, alder carr, and treacherous peat bogs. It was a place where the map simply gave up. To an outsider, it was a death trap. To a fugitive, it was the only safe place on earth. This is where we find the King of England in the spring of 878 AD. Alfred was no longer living in a timber hall with tapestries and wine. He was living in a hut made of wattle and daub, hidden on a small island of dry ground rising out of the swamp. The place was called Athelney, the Island of the Princes. It sounds regal, but in reality, it was a few acres of scrub rising above the black water. This is the nadir of the English monarchy, the Heptarchy, which had once boasted 7 proud kings, gold-hilted swords, and connections to Rome, had been reduced to a single man shivering in a swamp, eating whatever fish his men could catch in the murky channels. The psychological toll on Alfred must have been crushing. He was 29 years old. He was chronically ill, suffering from a mysterious stomach ailment, possibly Crohn's disease, that caused him constant pain. He had lost his brother, his kingdom, and his capital. He was surrounded by the news of defeat. Northumbria gone, East Anglia martyred, Mercia broken. He was the last candle flickering in a draughty room. But Alfred didn't give up. And this is why he gets the title, the Great. It's not because he won every battle. He didn't. It's because when he lost everything, he didn't flee to Rome or France. He stayed. He decided that if he couldn't be a king, he would be an insurgent. Athelney became the headquarters of the English resistance. Alfred and his small band of loyal retainers, the Harthweru, who had escaped Chippenham with him, started a guerrilla war. They couldn't face Guthrum's great heathen army in the open field. They would have been slaughtered. So they fought dirty. They built a causeway to the island that only they knew how to navigate. They launched raids on Viking foraging parties. They intercepted supplies. They struck from the mist and vanished back into the reeds before the Danes could form a shield wall. It was classic asymmetrical warfare. Alfred was teaching the English that they didn't need a massive army to fight. They just needed to be smarter than the enemy. It is from this desperate period that we get the most famous story in all of English history, the burning of the cakes. You've probably heard it. The king, in disguise, is sheltering in a peasant woman's hut. She asks him to watch her bread cakes baking by the fire, while she goes out to tend the animals. Alfred, distracted by his misery and plotting how to save his country, lets them burn. The woman comes back, smells the smoke, and boxes the king's ears, screaming at him, "You're happy enough to eat them, but you can't be bothered to turn them." Did it happen? Probably not. It appears in later hagiographies, not the contemporary chronicle, but like the story of George Washington and the cherry tree. It survives because it tells us something true about the character of the man. It emphasizes his total humiliation. He has fallen so low that a peasant woman doesn't even recognize him. He is stripped of all royal pretension. He is just a man, failing to bake bread, humbled before he can be exalted. It humanizes the legend. But while the legends focus on cakes, the reality was focused on logistics. Alfred wasn't just sitting by the fire. He was building a network. He used the intricate waterways of the levels to send messengers out. He needed to know if the people were still with him. Had the men of Wessex given up? Had they submitted to Guthrum? The answer that came back was a tentative no. The people were terrified, yes, but they hadn't defected. The men of the Shire, the local militias of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire, were waiting for a signal. Alfred also had a stroke of luck, or perhaps divine intervention, from the west. A Viking fleet led by Ubba, one of the brothers who killed St. Edmund, landed on the coast of Devon. They expected an easy conquest. Instead, they ran into a local Saxon ealdorman named Odda. Odda and his men were besieged in a hill fort, cut off from water. Instead of surrendering, they staged a dawn breakout. They caught the Vikings sleeping. Ubba was killed. The raven banner, a magical totem said to flutter its wings when victory was imminent, was captured. This victory at the Battle of Sinwit wasn't led by Alfred, but it was massive for morale. It proved that the Vikings could be beaten even without the king present. It took one of the three main Viking commanders off the board. Encouraged by this, Alfred decided it was time to gamble everything. 7 weeks after Easter, in May 878, he left the safety of the marshes. He sent out the order, Egbert Stone. This was the rendezvous point. We think it was somewhere near the border of Wiltshire and Somerset. It was a risky move. By gathering a large army in one place, he was exposing himself to Guthrum. If the Vikings found them before they were ready, it would be over. But the plan worked. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the scene with touching simplicity. As Alfred rode out of the woods and appeared at the stone, the men of the shires received him as one returned from the dead. They shouted for joy. They banged their spears on their shields. They had thought their king was gone, that England was finished. But here he was, a bit thinner, a bit muddy, but alive and calling for war. Alfred didn't waste time with speeches. He marched them. They moved quickly, covering ground to catch Guthrum off guard. Guthrum was currently at Edington, Ethandun, likely confident that Wessex was pacified. He wasn't expecting an army to emerge from the wilderness. The contrast between the two forces is striking. Guthrum commanded a professional army of conquerors, veterans who had smashed Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. They were well-armed, experienced, and successful. Alfred commanded a fyrd, a levy of farmers, smiths, and local landowners. They were fighting for their homes, their wives, and their survival. But Alfred had something Guthrum didn't. He had the landscape. He knew this country, and he had the desperate energy of a man who has stared into the abyss and climbed his way back out. As they approached Edington, the tension must have been unbearable. This wasn't just another battle in the year of battles. This was the final stand. If Alfred lost here, there was no returning to the swamp. There was no backup plan. The line of Cerdic would end on a Wiltshire hillside. Alfred arranged his men in a shield wall. This is the defining tactic of the age. Men stand shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their round shields to create a solid wall of wood and leather. It requires immense discipline. If one man runs, the wall breaks and the cavalry rides you down. Alfred, the six-scholar king, stood at the center. He looked at the Viking host arrayed against him. He looked at the men of Wessex who had answered his call, and he gave the order to advance. They weren't fighting for a kingdom anymore. The old Heptarchy was dead. They were fighting for the idea that this island still belonged to the English. The Battle of Edington was about to begin, and the fate of the English language hung on the strength of a shield wall held together by farmers. The Battle of Edington was not a battle of maneuvers. It wasn't about flanking cavalry or clever feints. In the 9th century, a shield wall battle is a shoving match. It is thousands of men locking their shields together, wood overlapping wood, rim to rim, and pushing. It is a terrifying, claustrophobic scrum where the front lines are crushed by the weight of the men behind them, and the air is thick with the smell of sweat, iron, and fear. Alfred stood at the center of the English line. Opposing him was Guthrum, the man who had hunted him through the winter, the man who had burned the monasteries of East Anglia. For hours, the two walls ground against each other on the Wiltshire hillside. The noise must have been deafening. The clash of spears against lindenwood shields, the screaming of the wounded, the rhythmic shouting of the commanders keeping the line steady. Bede and Asser, Alfred's biographer, tell us that the West Saxons fought bravely and perseveringly. That's a polite way of saying they refused to break. These weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers who knew that if this line broke, their farms would burn. They fought with the desperation of men who had seen the smoke rising from their neighbors' villages for a decade. And then the impossible happened. The Viking line cracked. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they were overconfident. Or maybe the sheer ferocious will of the men of the Shire simply overwhelmed them. The Danish shield wall shattered. The discipline dissolved. The great heathen army, which had never been truly defeated in the open field like this, turned and ran. Alfred didn't stop. He pursued them all the way back to their fortress at Chippenham, the very place Alfred had fled from in his pajamas just months earlier. The irony was perfect. He had chased the wolves back into their den. But this time, Alfred didn't offer money. In the past, the English kings would have paid the Danegeld to make them go away. Alfred knew that money only bought temporary safety. He wanted a permanent solution. So, he besieged them. He surrounded Chippenham. He cut off the food. He cut off the water. He waited. For 14 days, the Vikings sat in the fortress, hungry and terrified. They had eaten their horses. They were staring at starvation. Guthrum realized the game was up. He sent a messenger to Alfred offering to surrender. He offered hostages, as many as the king might wish to take. But Alfred demanded something else, something that seems bizarre to the modern mind, but was a stroke of geopolitical genius. He demanded that Guthrum become a Christian. Why? Was Alfred just a pious zealot? No, he was a realist. In the medieval mind, an oath sworn on a pagan arm ring meant nothing to a Christian king. And evidently, it meant little to the Vikings who kept breaking them. But if Guthrum was baptized, he would enter the spiritual hierarchy of Europe. He would have a godfather, and that godfather would be Alfred. By baptizing his enemy, Alfred wasn't just saving his soul, he was making him a son. He was asserting dominance. A godson cannot attack his godfather without committing a grave spiritual crime. It was a way to bind Guthrum into a system of feudal obligation. The ceremony took place at Aller, near the marshes of Athelney. It must have been a surreal scene. Guthrum, the fierce warlord who had sacrificed King Edmund to Odin, stood in a white robe, while Alfred poured the holy water over his head. Guthrum was given the Christian name Athelstan. For 12 days, the Vikings feasted with the Saxons at Wedmore. Alfred gave his new son gifts of gold and weapons. Then they drew a line on the map. This is the birth of the Danelaw, the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, finalized a few years later, formally divided England in two. The text of the treaty survives, and it's wonderfully specific. Up the Thames, and then up the Layer, and along the Layer to its source, then straight to Bedford, then up the Ouse to Watling Street. Basically, imagine a diagonal line running from London to Chester. Everything to the south and west of that line was English England, Wessex, English Mercia, and Kent. This was Alfred's domain. Everything to the north and east of that line was the Danelaw. This was Viking territory. Here, Danish law prevailed. The customs were Scandinavian. The heavy plough was used. The juries had 12 members, a Norse innovation. Alfred had essentially conceded half the island. He gave up Northumbria. He gave up East Anglia. He gave up the eastern half of Mercia, the 5 boroughs, Leicester, Nottingham, Derby, Stamford, and Lincoln. To some, this might look like a defeat. He had lost 50% of the territory. But Alfred saw the long game. By creating a defined border, he stopped the war of all against all. He created a stable neighbor he could talk to. Guthrum, true to his baptismal vows mostly, took his army back to East Anglia and settled down. He became a king, not a raider. He minted coins with his new name, Athelstan. The great heathen army beat its swords into plowshares, or at least into slightly less aggressive swords. With the immediate threat neutralized, Alfred turned his attention to the survival of his half of the island. He knew the peace wouldn't last forever. Other Vikings would come. So, he started a massive infrastructure project that would redefine the English landscape. He built the burhs, burh. The root of our word burrow and bury was a fortified town. Alfred created a network of over 30 of them across Wessex. The idea was simple, but brilliant. No village in Wessex should be more than 20 miles, a day's march, from a fortress. If the Vikings landed, the people could run to the burh. This changed the math of the invasion. The Vikings were raiders. They wanted quick loot. They didn't want to spend months besieging a network of fortified towns. The Burgel-Hedage, a document from this time, lists these forts and exactly how many men were needed to defend the walls. 4 men for every roughly 5 yards of wall. It was a mathematically precise system of national defense. He also realized that waiting for the Vikings to land was a bad strategy. It's better to fight them on the water. So, Alfred ordered the construction of a navy. The Chronicle says he designed the ships himself. They were almost twice as long as the others. Some had 60 oars, some more. They were both swifter and steadier, and also higher than the others. Historians debate whether Alfred truly founded the Royal Navy. Kings had used ships before, but he was certainly the first to use naval power as a systematic policy of defense. He was taking the fight to the Channel. But Alfred's most important rebuilding project wasn't made of wood or stone. It was made of words. He looked at his kingdom and saw that the libraries were burned. The priests couldn't read Latin. The wisdom of the past was being lost. Alfred believed that the Viking invasions were a punishment from God for the decline in learning. To prevent it from happening again, he had to make his people smart. He started a program of translation. He learned Latin himself in his late 30s amidst all this war, and began translating key books into Old English: Boethius, St. Augustine, Gregory the Great. He sent these books to his bishops with a famous object called an astel, a pointer used for reading. The Alfred jewel, found in Somerset, is likely one of these. It's a beautiful object of rock crystal and gold, inscribed, "Alfred ordered me to be made." He wanted every freeborn man in England who had the means to learn to read English. This was revolutionary. Charlemagne had promoted Latin. Alfred promoted the vernacular. He was democratizing knowledge because he believed a literate kingdom was a strong kingdom. In 886 AD, Alfred made his boldest move yet. He marched on London. London had been in a weird limbo, traded back and forth, often occupied by Vikings. Alfred besieged it, took it, and then gave it away. He didn't keep it for Wessex. He handed it to his son-in-law, Ethelred, the Lord of Mercia. This was a masterstroke of diplomacy. By liberating London, but letting the Mercians run it, he cemented the alliance between Wessex and English Mercia. He wasn't a conqueror. He was a liberator. The Chronicle says that all the English people that were not under subjection to the Danes submitted to him. He was now, officially, the king of the Anglo-Saxons, not just the king of Wessex. He was the king of everyone who wasn't a Viking. By the time Alfred died in 899 AD, the map had stabilized. The island was divided, yes. The north was Danish. The south was English. But the existential panic of 878 was gone. There was a system. There were walls. There were ships. And there were books. Alfred had saved the patient. But the patient was still in recovery. And the Vikings in the Danelaw weren't going anywhere. They were farming, trading, and breeding. The next phase of the Heptarchy, or what was left of it, wouldn't be about survival. It would be about reconquest. And for that, Alfred needed more than just books. He needed a warrior. As luck would have it, his genes had produced one of the finest military minds of the age. But it wasn't his son, Edward, who would steal the spotlight in the next decade. It was his daughter. We are about to meet the Lady of the Mercians. If you think the story of the Anglo-Saxons is just about bearded men hitting each other, you are about to be corrected by Ethelflaed. She is the warrior queen who will take the fight to the Vikings and start erasing that line Alfred drew on the map. If you were a betting man in the year 900 AD, looking at the map of England, you wouldn't necessarily bet on the House of Wessex surviving. Alfred was dead. His son, Edward the Elder, was on the throne, but the Vikings in the Danelaw were restless. They had regrouped. They had new leaders. The peace of Alfred and Guthrum was fraying at the edges. But the Vikings had made a critical calculation error. They looked at the English leadership and saw a king in Winchester. They completely failed to notice the queen in the Midlands. Her name was Ethelflaed, and she is, without hyperbole, one of the most competent military commanders this island has ever produced. Ethelflaed was Alfred's eldest daughter. She had grown up in the war zone. She was a child when the great heathen army was burning kingdoms. She was a teenager when her father was hiding in the swamp. She didn't learn needlepoint. She learned logistics. She married Ethelred, the Lord of the Mercians, Alfred's ally, who controlled the western half of the Midlands. It was a political marriage designed to bind the two English kingdoms together, but it became a partnership of war. By the early 10th century, her husband Ethelred was sick. The sources are vague. They just say he was infirm. Slowly, the reins of power in Mercia slipped from his hands into hers. In a society that was aggressively patriarchal, where women were usually relegated to the roles of peace weaver or abbess, this was extraordinary. The Mercians, a tough border people who had been fighting the Welsh and the Vikings for centuries, didn't revolt. They didn't scoff. They looked at Ethelflaed, saw that she knew how to build a wall and organize a kill zone, and said, "Ma'am, yes, ma'am." She became known as the Myrkna Ledige, the Lady of the Merchants. Note the title. She wasn't called Queen, because that would have upset the delicate hierarchy with her brother Edward in Wessex. But make no mistake, she was a queen in iron. Ethelflaed's strategy was aggressive. Alfred had built burhs to defend Wessex. Ethelflaed built burhs to strangle the Danelaw. She moved her frontier forward, inch by inch. She would march her army into enemy territory, seize a strategic river crossing or a hill, and build a fortress. Then she would garrison it. Suddenly, the local Vikings couldn't raid. They couldn't move supplies. They were boxed in. She refortified Chester in 907 AD, turning the old Roman ruins into a bastion that controlled the Irish Sea. She built forts at Bridgenorth, Tamworth, Stafford, Warwick, and Runcorn. If you look at a map, she was building a noose around the Danelaw. But she wasn't just a builder. She was a raider. In 909 AD, she and her brother Edward launched a joint operation into the Danelaw. It wasn't for land, it was for a coast. They raided Bardney Abbey in Lincolnshire, deep in Viking territory. Their objective, the bones of St. Oswald. Remember Oswald, the Northumbrian king whose arm was cut off by Penda. His bones were relics of immense power. By stealing them back from the pagans, Ethelflaed was scoring a massive propaganda victory. She brought the bones back to Gloucester and built a new minster to house them. She was claiming the spiritual heritage of the ancient Northumbrian kings, weaving the history of the Heptarchy into her own legitimacy. The Vikings, understandably, were furious. In 910 AD, they decided to break this annoying brother-sister duo once and for all. A massive Viking army from Northumbria marched south. They ravaged the Midlands, burning and looting, thinking they could smash Mercia and retreat before the English could mobilize. They were wrong. Ethelflaed and Edward had coordinated their forces perfectly. They trapped the Viking army at Wensfield, near Tettenhall in Staffordshire. The Battle of Tettenhall is the forgotten meat grinder of the Viking Age. It was catastrophic for the Danes. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gleefully lists the dead: 3 kings, Eowls, Halfdan, and Ivar, and thousands of rank-and-file warriors. The northern Vikings were shattered. They would never threaten the Midlands again. The following year, 911 AD, Ethelflaed's husband died. In any other era, this would be the moment the widow retires to a nunnery and a male cousin takes over. Not this time. The Mercian Witan, the Council of Nobles, unanimously accepted Ethelflaed as their sole ruler. It is the only time in Anglo-Saxon history a female ruler was elected to lead a kingdom at war. Now, ruling alone, the lady went on the offensive. She targeted the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, the fortified cities that formed the spine of Viking power in the Midlands. In 917 AD, she marched on Derby. Derby was a stronghold. The Vikings were dug in. Ethelflaed didn't starve them out. She stormed the walls. The chronicle tells us it was a fierce fight. Ethelflaed lost 4 of her personal thegns inside the gates, men she had raised and trained herself. Their deaths hit her hard, but she took the city. The first of the 5 boroughs had fallen. In 918 AD, she moved on Leicester. The Viking army there didn't even fight. They saw what happened at Derby. They saw the lady's army, and they surrendered peacefully. The dominoes were falling. The most incredible moment came later that year. The Vikings of York, the great northern capital, the city that had killed Aila and Osbert, sent envoys to Ethelflaed. They offered to submit to her, not to her brother in Wessex, but to her. She had become so terrifyingly effective that the grandsons of the great heathen army were bowing to Alfred's daughter. She was on the verge of uniting England. She was in Tamworth, preparing to ride north to accept the surrender of York. It would have been the crowning achievement of the century, but history is cruel. On June 12th, 918, just as the envoys were preparing the city for her arrival, Ethelflaed died at Tamworth. She was around 48 years old. We don't know the cause. Perhaps illness, perhaps the toll of a lifetime in the saddle. Her body was carried to Gloucester and buried in the church she had built for St. Oswald, right next to her husband. The aftermath of her death reveals just how unique she was. She left a daughter, Aelfwine. For a few months, Aelfwine was technically the second lady of the Mercians, but the sharks were circling. Her uncle Edward, the King of Wessex, wasn't going to let an inexperienced girl hold the keys to the Midlands. In December 918, Edward marched into Mercia. He didn't come as a conqueror, ostensibly, but the result was the same. He removed Aelfwine from power and sent her into a nunnery in Wessex. She disappears from history, a tragic footnote to her mother's glory. Edward absorbed Mercia directly into Wessex. There would be no more king or lady of the Mercians. The ancient kingdom of Penda and Offa was extinguished, becoming just a province of the new kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons. Edward was a capable king. He finished the job his sister started, capturing the rest of the Danelaw and pushing the boundaries north. But he lacked Ethelflaed's flair. He was the administrator. She was the paladin. Together, they had achieved what Alfred could only dream of, the reconquest of the Midlands and East Anglia. By the 920s, the political map of Britain had simplified drastically. The Heptarchy was a memory. The Danelaw south of the Humber had been swallowed by the English machine. There were now only three real powers left on the island. The kingdom of the English, Wessex and Mercia, fused together. The Viking kingdom of York, still holding out in the north. The kingdom of the Scots, consolidating power in the far north. The stage was set for the final act. The kingdom of England was almost ready to be born, but it needed one final, bloody baptism to weld the pieces together. It needed a king who could think like a Roman emperor and fight like a Viking berserker. Edward died in 924 AD. He left behind a clutter of sons from 3 different marriages. The succession was messy. There were rumors of assassination, poison, and civil war. But out of the confusion emerged a young man with golden hair and a terrifyingly high opinion of himself. He was Athelstan, Ethelflaed's favorite nephew. He had been raised in her court in Mercia, learning the art of war at the feet of the lady. He had the blood of Cerdic and the training of Ethelflaed. Athelstan is the first man who can legally and truthfully claim the title, King of all England. But he didn't get it by asking nicely. He got it by fighting the biggest battle the island had ever seen. A clash of 5 kings that would determine the fate of Britain for the next 1,000 years. We are heading to Brunanburh. The Great War of the 10th century is about to begin. The Vikings, the Scots, and the Britons are going to form a massive coalition to stop the English juggernaut. And Athelstan is going to meet them with a sword in one hand and a poem in the other. Athelstan was 30 years old when he took the crown, and he was a man fully formed by the wars of his youth. He had the golden hair of his grandfather Alfred and the tactical ruthlessness of his aunt Ethelflaed. He was a cosmopolitan king, a collector of holy relics and foreign books, a man who wore his hair ringleted with gold threads, but beneath the jewelry was a spine of steel. He was about to drag the island, kicking and screaming, into a single political unit. His reign began with a statement of intent. In 927 AD, the Viking king of York, Sihtric, died. Athelstan didn't wait for a successor to emerge. He marched north. He didn't stop at the border of the Danelaw. He rode straight through the gates of York. The Northumbrian Danes, seeing the size of his army, and perhaps remembering the reputation of the Lady of the Mercians who had trained him, submitted without a fight. For the first time since the Romans left, a single king ruled from the English Channel to the Firth of Forth. But Athelstan wasn't done. He summoned the other kings of Britain to meet him. They gathered at Amont Bridge in Cumbria on the 12th of July, 927 AD. It was a humiliating who's who of the Celtic fringe. Constantine, the king of Scots, Owain, the king of Strathclyde, Hywelda, the king of the Welsh. Athelstan made them swear oaths of loyalty. He made them renounce idolatry, a swipe at the Vikings. And effectively, he made them his clients. On his coins, he stopped calling himself Rex Anglorum, King of the English, and started using a new, terrifying title, Rex Dotius Britanniae, King of all Britain. For 10 years, Athelstan sat at the center of this web, the spider in the middle of the island. He was the most powerful man in Europe after Charlemagne's successors. He sent his sisters to marry the future King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor. He was a global player, but in the Heptarchy, or what was left of it, power creates gravity, and gravity pulls enemies together. The other kings of Britain looked at Athelstan and saw an existential threat. They realized that if they didn't stop him now, there would be no Scotland, no Strathclyde, no Viking Dublin. There would only be England. So they did the unthinkable. They formed a coalition of opposites. Constantine, the elderly Christian king of Scots, formed an alliance with Olaf Guthfrithson, the pagan Viking king of Dublin. It was a union of the wolf and the lamb, driven by the fear of the lion. They were joined by the British kings of Strathclyde. In the late summer of 937 AD, the trap was sprung. A massive Viking fleet sailed from Dublin and landed in the northwest of England. They linked up with the Scots and the Strathclyde Britons. This wasn't a raid. It was an invasion force designed to decapitate the English kingdom. Athelstan was slow to react. The old poems say he languished in languor. Perhaps he was gathering his strength, or perhaps he was waiting for the enemy to march deep into his territory so he could cut off their retreat. He waited until they were fully committed, and then he moved. He brought his younger brother, Edmund, a boy of just 16, and the full might of the West Saxon and Mercian levies. They met the coalition army at a place called Brunanburh. We still don't know exactly where Brunanburh is. It is the greatest geographical mystery in English history. Most historians now think it was on the Wirral Peninsula near modern Bromborough, but others argue for Lancashire or Yorkshire. But while the location is lost, the noise of the battle still echoes in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The entry for 937 AD breaks out of prose and turns into a poem. The scribes realized that normal language wasn't enough to describe what happened. They needed verse. The Battle of Brunanburh was described as the Great War. It lasted from dawn until sunset. This was unusual. Most shield wall battles were over in an hour or two. This was a grinding, exhausting slaughter. The poem tells us that the field flowed with blood from the moment the sun, that glorious star, rose in the morning. Athelstan and Edmund led the charge. The English shield wall, described as a hewer of battle shields, crashed into the coalition line. The fighting was savage. The poem revels in the imagery, the hammered blades, the hard handplay, the clash of banners. It describes the Mercians refusing to withhold hard handplay from any enemy. By late afternoon, the coalition broke. The result was a catastrophe for the invaders. The poem lists the VIP casualties with grim satisfaction. 5 young kings lay dead on the battlefield, put to sleep by swords. 7 of Olaf's earls were killed. The son of Constantine, the heir to the Scottish throne, was left dead in the mud, ground to pieces. Constantine, the grey-haired warrior, fled north to Scotland. He had come to save his kingdom and had lost his son. Olaf fled back to his ships, pushing off into the Fallow flood to sail back to Dublin, humiliated. The English losses were heavy. 2 of Athelstan's cousins were killed, but the victory was total. The poem ends with a boast that connects Athelstan directly to the history we've been exploring. Never before this was more slaughter on this island. Of a slain army, downed by the sword edge, according to books, writings of old historians, since from the east Angles and Saxons came to land. Over broad brims sought Britain. Proud warsmiths overcame the Welsh. Men eager for glory got a country. It's a perfect closing of the circle. The poet is saying, we came here as invaders under Hengist and Horsa. We fought for this land. And now, at Brunanburh, we have secured it forever. Brunanburh confirmed the existence of England. It proved that the unified kingdom could fight a war on multiple fronts and win. It broke the power of the Viking-Scot alliance for a generation. Athelstan spent the last 2 years of his life in undisputed dominance. He was the first king to be crowned with a ceremony that looks like the modern coronation. Anointing with oil, putting on the crown, the whole ritual we still see in Westminster Abbey. He was a lawmaker, issuing codes that tried to regulate everything from the tracking of cattle to the punishment of young thieves. He was surprisingly lenient, raising the age of execution because he thought killing children was cruel. But Athelstan, like so many powerful kings, had a fatal flaw. He had no son. He never married. Some say this was a religious vow. Others say he didn't want to create rival claimants that would threaten his brothers. When he died in Gloucester in 939 AD, the crown passed to his half-brother, the boy warrior of Brunanburh, Edmund. Athelstan's death was a shock, and immediately the unity he had forged began to crack. The Vikings in Dublin saw their chance and came back. York was lost again. The North rebelled. It would take another 15 years of fighting under Edmund and his brother Edred to finally, permanently drag Northumbria back into the fold. But the idea of England didn't die with Athelstan. He had proven it was possible. He had shown that the Heptarchy was obsolete. There was no going back to 7 kingdoms. There was only one throne, and the only question now was who was strong enough to sit in it. The mid-10th century was a time of consolidation. The fighting was fierce, but it was the fighting of a civil war, not an existential struggle for survival. The Vikings of the Danelaw were becoming Englishmen. They were converting to Christianity. Oda, an Archbishop of Canterbury in this period, was a full-blooded Dane. The cultures were merging. The stage was set for the final, glittering sunset of the Anglo-Saxon age. We are moving toward the reign of a king who didn't need to fight a battle like Brunanburh, because everyone was already afraid of him. He is the king who marks the true end of the Heptarchy era and the beginning of the medieval English state. He was a small man, perhaps, but he cast a long shadow. He was crowned in Bath, not at the beginning of his reign, but at the end as a kind of victory lap. And the image of his power isn't a shield wall flowing with blood. It's a boat on a river, rowed by kings. We are heading to Chester, to the River Dee, to witness the coronation of Edgar the Peaceful. It is the moment when the seven kingdoms finally, officially, and ceremonially become one. If history is a landscape, the mid-10th century is a broad, sunlit plateau. After the craggy peaks of Penda's wars, the dark ravines of the Viking invasions, and the bloody uphill climb of Athelstan's conquests, we finally reach a place where the ground levels out. The storms have passed. The shield walls are unlinked. The screaming has stopped. We have arrived at the reign of King Edgar, a man whose nickname, the Peaceable, sounds almost boring compared to Bloodaxe or Ironside. But in the Middle Ages, boredom is the ultimate luxury. Edgar took the throne in 959 AD. He was only 16, but he had the distinct advantage of inheriting a machine that actually worked. His uncle Athelstan had beaten the enemies into submission. His father Edmund and uncle Edred had mopped up the resistance. The Danelaw was quiet. The Welsh were paying tribute. The Scots were staying on their side of the fence. For the first time in 500 years, a king of England didn't have to wake up every morning wondering which river the Vikings were rowing up. Edgar is fascinating because he proves that you don't need to be a warlord to be a powerful Anglo-Saxon king. He was a micromanager. He was the CEO who obsessively checked the accounts. He reformed the currency again, standardized weights and measures, so a pound of wool in York weighed the same as in Exeter, and organized the navy into a permanent patrol force that circled the island every summer, like a shark guarding a reef. But Edgar didn't do it alone. Standing just behind his shoulder, usually whispering in his ear, was a man who might be the most important figure in the late Saxon age. Saint Dunstan. Dunstan was the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he was really the Prime Minister. He was a blacksmith, a musician, an artist, and a politician of terrifying intellect. He's famous in folklore for the story where he used his blacksmith tongs to grab the devil by the nose when tempted. That's the kind of energy Dunstan brought to the table. He didn't suffer fools, and he certainly didn't suffer the devil. Together, Edgar and Dunstan launched the Benedictine reform. This sounds dry, but it was a cultural revolution. They kicked out the corrupt, married priests who were treating monasteries like private hotels and replaced them with strict, celibate monks following the rule of Saint Benedict. They rebuilt the libraries Alfred had started. They illuminated manuscripts with a new style, the Winchester style, that dripped with gold leaf and lush, naturalistic foliage. England became rich, pious, and artistic. It was a second golden age, quieter than the Northumbrian one, but more stable. But Edgar knew that stability is fragile. It needs theater to sustain it. You have to show people you are the boss, not just tell them. In 973 AD, near the end of his reign, Edgar staged the greatest piece of political theatre the island had ever seen. He organized a coronation. Now, kings had been crowned before, but this was different. This was designed by Dunstan to be a sacrament. It took place at Bath, the old Roman city of steam and stone. The symbolism was heavy. Edgar was linking himself to the Roman imperial past. The ceremony Dunstan wrote for that day is still, almost word for word, the core of the coronation service used for British monarchs today. When you watch a coronation on television, with the anointing oil, the ring, the sword, and the anthem, Zadok the priest, biblically speaking, you are watching a script written for Edgar in 973. He was 40 years old. He wasn't being made king. He had been king for 14 years. This was a confirmation. It was England marrying its king. But the real climax came a few months later. Edgar traveled north to Chester, to the River Dee. This is the moment the Heptarchy truly ends. It's the final scene of our long, bloody movie. Edgar ordered the other kings of Britain to meet him there. And they came. The Chronicle says there were 6 kings. Later, writers say 8. They included Kenneth, king of Scots, Malcolm, king of the Cumbrians, Maccus, king of many islands, the Viking ruler of the Manx and Hebrides, and various Welsh princes. These were the men who, a century earlier, would have been tearing England apart. They met Edgar at his palace. Then they went to the river. A boat was waiting. It was a ceremonial barge, likely gilded and draped in tapestry. Edgar got in and sat at the helm, taking the steering ropes. The other kings, the rulers of Scotland, Wales, and the Isles, took off their cloaks, rolled up their sleeves, and sat at the oars. Imagine the visual. The King of England steering the ship of state, while the other kings of Britain provide the muscle. They rowed him from the palace to the church of St. John the Baptist, while the crowds cheered from the riverbanks. It was an act of total submission. By rowing him, they were acknowledging that they were his thanes, his servants. It was Edgar saying to the world, there is no Mercia, there is no Wessex, there is no Northumbria. There is only this, the Empire of Britain, or the Heptarchy, that chaotic, beautiful, violent wrestling match between 7 kingdoms, had been smelted down. The fire of the Viking wars had melted the borders, and the hammer of the House of Wessex had forged them into a single sword. The logic of geography and religion had finally won out over tribal loyalty. When Edgar died 2 years later, in 975 AD, he was buried at Glastonbury. He left behind a unified nation, a reformed church, and a prosperous economy. The process was complete. Of course, history never truly ends. We know what comes next. We know that Edgar's sons, Edward the Martyr and Ethelred the Unready, will face a new wave of Vikings. We know that in 1066, the Normans will arrive and change the language and the aristocracy forever. We know that the English identity will continue to mutate and evolve. But the story of the Heptarchy, the story of how a vacuum left by Rome became a patchwork of warlords, and how that patchwork became a nation, closes here. The sun sets over the River Dee. The rowing stops. The oars are lifted, dripping water into the calm current. The kings step onto the dock, shivering slightly in the evening chill. The noise of the crowd fades. We have traveled from the dark, smoke-filled hall of Hengist and Horsa, listening to the guttural shouts of a new language, to the stone cathedral of Bath, hearing the soaring Latin of a coronation anthem. We have seen the mud of the trenches and the gold of the garnets. We have seen the pagan fires die out and the candles of the scriptorium lit. The seven kingdoms are gone. England remains. I hope you've enjoyed this journey through the fire and the mist. It's a long road from the Roman exit to the river at Chester, but it's the road that built the world we know. If you're still awake, thank you for listening. If you've drifted off, sleep well. Good night.